A crime committed in light, but the killer casts no shadow. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallow. Drop a comment. Where are you tuning in? Your presence makes these mysteries unforgettable. I'm grateful for each of you. The affair began on a June afternoon that ought to have been unremarkable, for the sky was a bright, flawless blue, and the lawns of Greyfriars House lay under the precise symmetry of their clipped yew hedges. Yet by tea-time, a man lay dead in the sunlit library, and by supper, every guest knew they were in the presence of something far more sinister than tragedy. Greyfriars belonged to Sir Alistair Vernon, a man of precise breeding and a notorious host of weekend gatherings where politics, business, and art converged under the polite cover of cucumber sandwiches. On this particular Friday, his guest list included the sort of names that made newspaper columnists write about those in the know. There was Lady Constance Vale, whose husband had died with suspicious swiftness 2 years ago and left her a fortune in shipping. Lionel Grant, a financier whose fortune was rumoured to rest on cards as much as commerce. Dr. Felix Moreau, a celebrated physician with the manners of a courtier, and Miss Iris Tolland, a young woman who seemed always to arrive in a room half a second before anyone noticed her. The last of the party was Mr. Jasper Lockwood, a writer of detective stories who fancied himself a man of insight. He had, as it happened, made himself quite disagreeable over luncheon by proclaiming loudly that murderers were nearly always caught, not because of evidence, but because they betrayed themselves in some unconscious slip. The day proceeded with a kind of brittle cheerfulness. Croquet on the lawns, lemonade served from crystal jugs, the faint hum of bees among the white roses. At precisely 4 o'clock, the gong sounded for tea in the drawing-room. Everyone assembled, everyone except Jasper Lockwood. When Lionel Grant went in search of him half an hour later, he returned pale and stammering. "He's in the library," he managed. He's dead." The scene was a study in stillness. Lockwood sat slumped in a leather armchair, his head tilted awkwardly to one side. A book lay open on his lap, but his eyes were half closed, glazed. There was no sign of disturbance, no scattered papers, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. The French windows stood open onto the sunlit terrace, the afternoon light spilling in, yet for all that brilliance, there was an odd impression, difficult to name, of something missing. Sir Alistair, practical to a fault, sent his butler for the local constable, but it was Lady Constance who first said what everyone else avoided. "This is murder." The doctor, kneeling to examine the body, frowned. "Perhaps," he murmured, "but if so, no struggle, no sign of poison, nothing visible." The phrase settled over the room like a shadow that was not there. Nothing visible. It was exactly so. No wound, no mark, no telltale odour. The man appeared, if one could ignore the unnatural stillness, to be merely dozing in the sun. By evening, the constable had done his best, which was not much. The body would go to the coroner in the morning. The guests were politely but firmly told they must remain until the inquest. There were murmurs, tight smiles, and more than one pair of eyes that avoided the others. It was then that Sir Alistair, pacing before the library hearth, stopped abruptly and said, "There is one man, only one, who could make sense of this." The others looked up. "Hercule Poirot," he said simply. "I shall wire him tonight." It was not yet 9 when the motor car crunched up the gravel before Greyfriars House. The day had that thin, expectant brightness peculiar to English mornings after a day too beautiful to trust. In the doorway, Sir Alistair stood with his hands behind his back and his jaw set. Near him hovered his butler, Alder, as grave as an undertaker. The driver opened the door, and with a small carefulness of movement that belonged entirely to him, a little man with an egg-shaped head and waxed moustaches stepped down and raised his hat. Hercule Poirot surveyed the façade as a physician might examine a patient before hearing a single symptom. The windows were tall and wide. The stone steps were worn to a polish. Everything suggested money, allied to a taste for proportion. "Monsieur Poirot," said Sir Alister, and the control in his voice only half masked the relief. "You have our gratitude for coming at such short notice." "But naturally," murmured Poirot, "one does not refuse a friend when there is a death on a summer afternoon. Besides, you promised me excellent coffee." His eyes flicked past Sir Alister to the hall, gleaming parquet, a grandfather clock with a calm face, a spray of lilies whose scent knitted with beeswax. "We will talk, yes? And then, if you are so good, I see the room." They moved in a procession that Alder managed with invisible strings. The visitor divested of gloves and hat, a silver tray appearing with coffee that made Poirot's eyebrows approve, and then the door to the library opening with a hush of carpet. It might have been any gentleman's room. Leather, dark wood, good bindings, a portrait of some dead Vernum looking over his descendant's taste with tolerant eyes. Yet even now, when the body had been taken away before sunrise under the constable's dour instructions, the room carried a sense of its former stillness. Poirot stood in the centre, his head a fraction to one side, and took in the comfortable chair by the French windows, the small occasional table with a single cup-ring on the polished top, the book that had been replaced upon the shelf with fussy care by some well-meaning person, and the faint shadow of an armchair leg on the carpet where, until recently, the sun had made a square of light. "You had the kindness to leave the curtains as they were?" he asked without turning. "Exactly as we found them," said Sir Alister. The constable thought, well, he thought very little beyond keep everyone in the house. Alors. Poirot stepped to the French doors. Beyond them the terrace ran like a stage into the green lawns. The stone was still cool. The roses beyond, immodest with fragrance, leaned in their beds. Yesterday, at 4 o'clock, tea was served in the drawing-room. At 4 precisely. And at half after 4, Monsieur Grant discovered Monsieur Lockwood here, dead. Poirot's fingertips brushed the latch. The doors stood like this. They were open, yes. The air was warm. And the book? On his lap, said Sir Alister, the distaste in his voice sharpened by memory. It was one of his own. He seemed to think it diverting to read himself. Writers, said Poirot gravely, have their vanities. It is useful for me to know them. He turned at last and looked full at the host. Now, if you please, you shall tell me of your guests. The little details only. The full histories. They will come later. Who they are to you. Why you asked them. What it is each one desires that he has not yet achieved. People are most themselves in what they lack. Sir Alister blinked. Then, because his sense of efficiency was not greatly different from Poirot's own, obeyed. Lady Constance Vale, a cousin by marriage, clever and handsome, and lately too fond of dangerous speculations in the city, encouraged, he said with dislike, by men who admired her nerves. Lionel Grant, invited for his utility, a financier whose connections might support a railway scheme Sir Alister favoured. Dr. Felix Moreau, a Frenchman naturalised and celebrated for his discretion among the sick and fashionable. Miss Iris Tolland, the companion to Sir Alister's widowed sister some years ago, and still a welcome guest for her talents at the piano, and her way of making a table look better by being at it. And Jasper Lockwood, who had pressed for an invitation by a jocular letter, promising to pillory them all in a novel if denied. He liked to shock, Sir Alister finished with a tightening of his mouth. He said over luncheon that murderers betray themselves by some unconscious slip. We all laughed then. It is not amusing now. Non, said Poirot. He moved to the armchair, viewed it from the door, then from the terrace, then sat in it himself for a moment, and arranged his cuffs before rising again. You have excellent Alder for the butler. Who else? The housekeeper, Mrs. Hargreaves, a maid, Rose, the cook, Mrs. Bridie, a gardener, Pritchard, and my valet, Jenner. None of them. He stopped and looked uneasy for the first time. None of them had cause to wish Lockwood ill. He was boorish yesterday, yes, but people have killed for less. But we do not begin with melodrama, Poirot said gently. We begin with order. At 4, all were at tea, save Monsieur Lockwood. Before then, after luncheon, how was the time passed? Croquet, Sir Alister said. Grant, Lady Constance, Iris, and myself. Dr. Moreau refused and read in the morning room. Lockwood wandered in and out. The man could not keep still. Did anyone see him in this room between luncheon and the tea gong? Sir Alister frowned. I cannot say. People went for refills. Iris fetched music from the piano in here at 3:30. The doors were open all day. Bon. Poirot's eyes, which had lingered on the cup ring, took in the faint scuff at the foot of the bookcase nearest the chair, a slighter impression in the pile of the carpet, where a foot might have pressed and then been withdrawn, the geometry of the sun's path, which had left one square of the rug brighter. He looked at the portrait above the chimney, and from a pocket produced a handkerchief, and with apology to Sir Alister, corrected the angle of a bronze paper knife that lay across the hearth ledge. Now, we will make the acquaintance of everyone. You will bring them to me in the small morning room, one by one, and after, we shall all sit together and talk as friends. To begin, perhaps, with the butler. He sees everything and speaks very little. Alder entered with the silence of his profession. In Poirot's presence, he did not so much stiffen as refine his already exact lines, like a soldier passing to attention. He had attended the tea, yes. Mr. Lockwood was not present. At 4:10, he had taken a telegram to Sir Alister. At 20 past, he had been in the pantry. At 1/2 past, Mr. Grant had rung the bell with urgency, and Alder had gone to the library to find what the gentleman had found. Mr. Lockwood appeared asleep, sir. Dr. Moreau asked for a mirror. There was no breath upon it. And you touched nothing after that? Nothing, sir. I closed the doors as the constable requested. Poirot inclined his head. You noticed, perhaps, if Monsieur Lockwood had partaken of tea earlier? I could not say, sir. A cup was not brought out for him. When Alder had gone, Mrs. Hargreaves came, broad, composed, her hands folded over the black of her dress. She had been upstairs at 4, she said, replacing linen. She had disliked Mr. Lockwood in the way one dislikes a draught through a closed door. He had asked questions, impertinent ones, of the staff that morning. About whom Lady Constance telephones, she said, with a firmness that was also disapproval, as if it were his place to know. Ah, said Poirot. He let it hang in the air like a note waiting for its harmony. Rose the maid trembled in her shoes and grew pink when she spoke of Miss Tolland, whom she admired for her pretty dresses and quiet voice. Yes, she had passed the library at 4:05. The doors were open. Mr. Lockwood was not there then. She had seen the book on the little table, though, because the cover had a skull upon it, sir, like on the Penny Dreadfuls. Dr. Moreau entered with his hat in his hands, as if he could not bear to be separated from it. He had not been the official physician, no. He had, as a gentleman, done what was decent. The man was dead, he told Poirot, with the tired patience of a man who has said so too often. If there were poison, it had left no scent. There are substances, he began, then stopped. But I do not theorize in a vacuum. Poirot thanked him, and only then called in the guests, one by one. Lionel Grant came first, quick and neat, and already irritable at the delay in his city meetings. He had found the body and disliked the memory. He had also disliked the man. A vulgarian, he said crisply. He threatened to put me in a book as a man with a horse's face. A horse, I ask you. Many faces of finance resemble the noble horse, Poirot returned, and Mr. Grant, uncertain if he had been complimented, ceased to pursue the metaphor. He had been at croquet until the gong, except for a moment to take a telephone call at 4:10, which I will not discuss, he added, and smiled with too many teeth. Lady Constance followed in a cloud of expensive scent that sat oddly with the faint tightness at the corners of her mouth. She had been charming at tea. She was charming now. Mr. Lockwood had been a wicked monkey and had deserved a slap. But death. One did not die in libraries as one might in novels. It was indecent. She treated Poirot with that mixture of flirtation and suspicion one reserves for a fortune-teller at a party, delighted to be amused, afraid to be seen through. When he asked whether Mr. Lockwood had teased her about money, she laughed too quickly. "Everyone teases me about money," she said. "It's how English people flirt when they have nothing to say." Miss Iris Tolland came last, for she had not been found at once. She had been walking in the rose garden at the back, she said, to clear her head of Mr. Lockwood's voice, which had followed her all morning. She was slight and wore a dress the colour of rainwater. Poirot watched her hands. They were unadorned, the nails trimmed square. When Sir Alister referred to her as our Iris, a fractional stillness crossed her face, a caught breath that most would miss. "I fetched music from the library at 3:30, she said. He was not there. The sun made squares of light on the carpet. It was pretty. She looked toward the French doors while she said it, as if the memory were attached not to the room, but to the light itself. By 11:30, Poirot had what he wanted. Not facts, not yet, but the rhythm of the house, the way conversation spooled and tightened, where silence fell, how eyes moved when certain names were spoken. He asked then, very pleasantly, that they should all meet in the drawing-room before luncheon. "It is good, is it not," he said as they gathered, "that we sit together and speak as friends? I am a great believer in the salon. It is there that people show the selves they have curated for others, and sometimes, between one cup of tea and the next, they forget which self they have brought to the table." He let them watch him fuss with a cushion that did not require fussing, and when their attention had softened, he began to make the room orderly in small, unnecessary ways, the arrangement of teaspoons, the straightening of a landscape on the wall. The effect was ridiculous and conscious both. It made them smile, irritated the practical, charmed the sentimental, and lulled the wary. Only Iris Tolland watched the teaspoons as if they might spell words. "You see," Poirot continued, "yesterday there was a very English afternoon. There was the croquet, how do you say, hammer, mallet. There was the tea, the sugar tongs. The roses were agreeable. And then, at the centre of this still life, a man died in a chair with a book about murder on his lap." He folded his hands. "If I asked you who wished Monsieur Lockwood dead, it would be indelicate. So I ask instead, who did he annoy?" Grant gave a short laugh. "Everyone. Exactement. Monsieur Lockwood. He was a man who knew that attention and enmity are cousins." Poirot looked not at Lady Constance, but at the point just beyond her shoulder. He asked questions, not with the curiosity that is sympathy, but with the curiosity that is leverage. He made notes. He told little jokes that were, perhaps, a little too sharp. And because of this, yesterday someone took advantage of the most dangerous of opportunities, the moment when a person is alone and looks as if he sleeps. No one moved. The clock put down a polite second after second, and outside the bees went on with their work. "There are, you understand," Poirot said softly, "3 doors to our little mystery. The first is that Monsieur Lockwood died by a hand that left no mark. The second is that he died at a time when all had reason to be elsewhere. And the third, the third door, concerns the sunlight." He let the word rest in the room. "It is the best of servants, the sunlight, and also the worst of witnesses. It shows what is there, and it shows sometimes what is not there." Sir Alister frowned. "I don't follow." "You will," said Poirot, and his smile was thin and amiable. "For the present, we shall do something very simple. We shall repeat our English afternoon, but without the death." Before anyone could object, he raised a hand. "Only a little rehearsal, mes amis. At 4, you will take tea as you did. You will move as you moved. You will fetch as you fetched. You will telephone as you telephoned. You will walk in the garden as you walked. And I will sit in the library and admire your roses. The sun will play its little tricks again, and we shall see if it is a more honest actor today." Lady Constance shivered theatrically. "How grim!" "On the contrary," said Poirot, and his eyes twinkled without ceasing to be sharp. "How orderly!" He dismissed them with a bow and returned once more to the library alone. The house, stripped of voices, yielded other sounds: the tick of wood, the distant clink of porcelain, a murmured instruction in the kitchen. Poirot stood where the armchair had stood and watched the pale square of the rug gather brightness as the sun slid. In the glass of the French doors, his reflection arranged itself tidily and looked back at him, and in that same glass, faint but there, he observed the terrace beyond and the line of shadow that the eaves threw across the stone. He raised a hand and held it in the square of light, studying the way his fingers printed their absence upon the floor. After a moment, he moved the occasional table an inch, then half an inch more, until the cup ring caught the light and shone like a coin. He considered it as a banker considers a sum, and nodded to himself. At 5 minutes to 4, he rang for Alder and asked for a small favour: that the maid Rose be sent to fetch a particular music book from the library at precisely the same moment she had done so the day before. At 4, the croquet mallets clicked on the lawn, and laughter, stiff, unnatural, spilled dutifully. Iris Tolland crossed the terrace with her eyes on the rose beds, and Lionel Grant's voice could be heard in the hall, saying something about a call he must make. Poirot sat very still in the armchair, and made himself a gentleman who had fallen asleep over his own cleverness. He let the light climb and the shadow creep, and studied, with a patience that was all of his art, how the afternoon arranged its facts. It was a dull business for most men. For Poirot, it was the beginning of shape in a room that had been all surfaces. When Rose paused at the threshold and hesitated, as she had not hesitated yesterday, he said only, "Courage, mademoiselle," in a voice as soft as dust. And when she scurried away, her hands empty, because some instinct had told her not to touch, he let the silence settle again, and smiled, very slightly, as if a small, necessary piece had moved into place. He did not yet have the name he wanted, but he had, at last, the outline of an absence, and in the outline, the promise of a shadow that ought to have been, and was not. At 4:15, when the cups had been duly tinkled, and the croquet laughter had obtained its brittle pitch, Poirot rose from the armchair and stood very still in the square of light that the windows poured upon the carpet. The sunlight had crept with obedient minuteness since he first sat. Now the bright geometry lay an inch beyond the place where the chair's front leg pressed the pile. He bent and laid 2 fingers upon the nap, drawing them back to see the faint line they made. The rug yielded, then rose, as a field does when wind runs through it. He looked at the occasional table, where the cup ring shone like a small moon. An hour ago he had slid the table half an inch until the ring caught that brilliance. Now, at this precise minute, the ring fell into the shadow cast by the window mullion. He nodded, as one nods at a train that has arrived exactly when expected. He went out by the French doors. The terrace stone was hot enough to hold the ghost of his step. From there, standing to the side so that the eaves threw their narrow shade past his shoulder, he watched the drawing-room through the open library door. Lady Constance, with her laugh a touch too loud. Iris, attentive to the sugar tongs as if they were a metronome. Lionel Grant, glancing at the hall clock as if it insulted him by existing. Sir Alister, correct and tired. Dr. Moreau, who smiled when spoken to, and otherwise sat as though practicing an economy of motion. Alder moved among them like a tide that leaves everything it touches a little more exact. He returned to the library and sat again, eyes half closed. When the hall reverberated with a brisk foot, and the telephone in the study, 2 doors down, gave its small, implacable bell, Poirot listened. He counted silently. After a brief interval, Lionel Grant's voice cut across the marble coolness. "For me," he said, and then lower, "Yes, hold." The word hold had the shape of impatience wrapped in courtesy. Poirot rose, crossed to the French doors, and stepped out so that his reflection, faint in the glass, stood where a man in the room might have looked and seen, if the light were kind, his own outline and the softer echo of the terrace beyond. He lifted his hand again and watched the air tremble in the heat. "Voilà," he murmured. "To be seen, to be not seen, it is a question of inches and of minutes." At past, he rang for Alder and asked, with a little apology for a whim, if the awning might be half unfurled over the terrace window. Alder complied. The striped canvas rolled out with a purr. Instantly the square on the carpet softened. The hard edge lost its surgeon's certainty and became domestic. Poirot let it be, and said nothing. They all came when he asked for them, because one does humour a famous man who speaks of rehearsals. He received them not in the library, but in the morning-room, where the light was mild and the furniture unassuming. They arranged themselves as people do when ranking themselves in relation to an audience. Grant took a chair that made him look important. Lady Constance chose one that made her look graceful. Iris hovered near the window. Sir Alister stood as a host who will not sit until his guests do. Dr. Moreau found a place at the margin, as if to suggest that he was ready to be useful, but not intrusive. "My thanks," Poirot said. "It is the tidiness of repetition that I admire. One sees where the day goes when one sends it on its little walk a second time. You, Monsieur Grant, had—" Again the telephone. "It rings at the same moment as yesterday. This is admirable punctuality." Grant's mouth did an irritated smile. "My broker telephones when the exchange opens. If I don't answer, he rings again. Is this of consequence?" "It may be of exactness," Poirot said, "and exactness is sometimes the servant of consequence." He let his gaze slide, apparently idly, to Iris. Mademoiselle fetched the music at the same time. She did not enter as far as yesterday. Iris coloured faintly. "Number—" There was a feeling, I could not say. The room, one has ideas. "One does," Poirot agreed, "and ideas are the shadows of our attention." He allowed the phrase to drift, as if it were merely something pretty. "I will tell you a thing that yesterday impressed itself upon the room. When Mr. Lockwood was found, the chair in which he sat cast no shadow where it should have done." "Cast no—" Sir Alister began, then stopped. "You mean the light? Forgive me, I'm not sure." "You will be," Poirot said gently. "In this room, at 4:30, with the doors open and the awning furled, there is each day a hard little square of sunlight upon the rug. It is punctual, it is faithful. If a chair stands partly within that square, the leg cuts a bar of shade through it, like the stroke of a pen." He held up 2 fingers to demonstrate. "Yesterday, when I came first, the square was there as it must be, and the imprint of the chair's leg upon the carpet lay in the light, but the shadow that should have accompanied it did not. Someone, after the time when the leg ought to have blocked the sun, moved either the chair or the awning, or both, and then replaced them in haste. That haste made a disorder that is too small for the eye of most men, but not for the eye of order." Lady Constance let out a soft exclamation. "But who would fuss with chairs after such a thing?" "Who indeed?" Poirot murmured. "But we do not run, we walk. We ask, why would anyone wish the sunlight to tell a different hour than the clock? Because the time of the death must be moved somehow, a little forward or a little back. If one changes the awning, one gains a few minutes of ambiguity, and if one is clever, One hopes to erase the shadow altogether. It is not so easy. The sunlight, she tattles. She is indiscreet. He turned, suddenly brisk. Monsieur Grant, your call, the first time yesterday, was before the gong, yes? 10 minutes to 4. Grant's eyes narrowed. Roughly, yes. And you went to the study. From the study, one may step by the side corridor to the terrace and the library doors, unseen. Grant gave a short laugh. Is this an accusation, Mr. Poirot? Because if so, it is absurd. It is an observation only. The absurdity, it is a cousin of truth. They visit each other. Do not be offended. Poirot spread his hands. I have asked Alder to permit the constable to view the awning mechanism. It is sturdy. It requires a little strength and a little thought. Those who handled it yesterday will have the print of chalk upon their fingers from the cord. If they wash their hands often, it will be gone. If they do not, well, we shall see. It was then that the constable, who had been much in awe and more in muddle, announced that he had something, and that something came in his large palm, a small brown bottle with no label, found, he said with satisfaction, in the waste bin of the housekeeper's room. Mrs. Hargreaves had gone pale and angry. She had insisted she had never seen it. The constable, encouraged by the drama, opined aloud that it looked like a physic, which in his opinion meant poison, and as if to crown his theory, Dr. Moreau, bending, said quietly that the smell was bitter almond, which he need not remind anyone meant cyanide. There was, as there is in such moments, a silly little silence out of which one person always speaks too quickly. How perfectly ghastly, said Lady Constance, her hand flying to her throat with a prettiness that had seen some practice. In the house, too, with the staff. One never knows, does one? Cyanide, Lionel Grant repeated in a flattened tone, looking hard at Dr. Moreau. Is that what you think? I do not think, said Dr. Moreau. I say the odour suggests. It is not proof. For that, we have examination. The constable, heartened, looked ready to arrest anyone within arm's reach. Poirot raised one finger and set him down with a schoolmaster's economy. Non, we do not leap, my friend. We step. If there is poison, there must be a way it was taken. There was no glass by Mr. Lockwood, except the one not brought for him. There was a cup ring upon the little table of which I am now most fond. There was a book on his lap. There was the air. The air? Iris spoke so softly the word almost did not arrive. Poirot smiled at her. There are poisons that travel by air, mademoiselle, vapours that are heavier than love and lighter than guilt. But to deliver such a thing without scent, that would be a conjuring trick, and I am not yet convinced our conjurer had that skill. He turned to the constable. Where did you find this bottle exactly? In the waste bin in Mrs. Hargreaves's room, the man said, swelling slightly. Ah, a place where any hand might drop a thing unobserved. The corridor is busy, the door often open, the mistress of the room frequently elsewhere, for she is diligent. Poirot's eyes went to Mrs. Hargreaves, whose indignation was of the kind that rests on innocence. No, we will not arrest the housekeeper to satisfy the appetite for a culprit. We will, however, ask what Mr. Lockwood put in his mouth yesterday. You make it sound like a luncheon, murmured Lady Constance, recovering her wit. It is a very small luncheon, Poirot returned. A sweet, perhaps, a lozenge, a cigarette. Did he smoke? Here and there, Sir Alister said. He had a silver case. He made a nuisance of himself with a new Turkish blend. Alder? Poirot said. The butler stepped forward, not as one summoned, but as one already present at the thought. Mr. Lockwood offered me one when he arrived, sir. I declined. He took one at 3 o'clock by the Sun. At 3, Poirot repeated, and then perhaps another after. If a cigarette were clever, it might do the work while a man read about his own cleverness. He let the idea walk a pace, and then held it still. But even a cigarette that kills leaves something. There is always a something. We will not guess which something, until we have more in our hands than a bottle found where any might hide it." Grant, whose colour had not improved during this measured contradiction of the constable's triumph, said with an attempt at briskness, "Then the obvious remains." Lockwood was a man of delicate heart. The sun was warm. He dozed and— "Do you propose to explain, then," Poirot interrupted very mildly, "why a man who dies of indifference to the precisions of this world should be the occasion for another man to adjust awnings and chairs to falsify the clock of the sun?" He did not look at Grant when he asked it. He arranged a pencil upon the writing table and put a sheet of paper square beneath it. "It is the vanity of murder to hope that disorder will go unnoticed. Alas for murder! The little grey cells love order too much." The constable, subdued, pocketed his bottle and withdrew to sulk among the rhododendrons. Mrs. Hargreaves, rigid with affront, asked if she might return to her linen presses. Poirot detained her only long enough to ask who among the staff had access to the morning room when guests were at croquet. "Everyone," she said with a scorch of dignity. "But no one lingers. Alder keeps a good house." When they had gone, Poirot remained with Sir Alister and Iris, for Grant excused himself with a call to return, and Lady Constance discovered that a rest was necessary. Dr. Moreau, apologizing, went to write a note to the coroner. The house, rid for a moment of its spectators, breathed again. "You are certain," Sir Alister said, "that this bottle—" "Is a gift," Poirot said. "A gift too large and too early. It invites us to be grateful and to stop thinking. I am not polite to such gifts." He looked toward the library, where the sun's square had moved beyond the ghost of the chair leg. "There is something charming about our murderer. He believes in staging. He loves a tableau. He wishes, perhaps, to be admired." "That sounds like Lockwood," Iris said unexpectedly, and then bit her lip. "Forgive me. It is a horrid thing to say." "It is a truthful thing," Poirot answered, "and therefore it is useful. Tell me, mademoiselle, yesterday at luncheon, Mr. Lockwood made his speech about unconscious slips. To whom did he look when he said it? The face one seeks when one makes a clever remark. There is meaning there," Iris thought. He looked at Lady Constance first, because she always laughed, and then at Dr. Moreau, as if inviting him to disagree. But when no one gave him the right sort of answer, he looked at Mr. Grant, and Mr. Grant looked away. "Eh bien?" Poirot's eyes were pleased, not triumphant. "We begin to have the pattern of a person who dislikes to be looked at. We shall not assume guilt from this, but we shall place it with our other little objects on the mantel and see which ones reflect the fire." He stood, and in that moment the grandfather clock in the hall paused and put down the hour with grave approval. "I will go and see our gardener. Pritchard, is it? He will have seen who moved an awning and who did not. Gardeners are like cats. They appear to be asleep, but their eyes are never closed." On the terrace, the awning threw its prim striped shadow. Beyond it, the rose beds were an ocean of white and blush. Poirot paused at the threshold. In the glass, for a fleeting second, the room and the garden married. Dark panelled shelves stitched to green lawns by the slim seam of the door, and in that seam a fact slid into place with so light a hand that a less tidy mind would have mislaid it. He smiled a little, almost tenderly, as one smiles at a child who has nearly solved a puzzle. The murderer had tried to make the sun complicit, and had forgotten what even the sun cannot do. It cannot give a sleeping man the weight of a shadow that is not his to cast. Pritchard was discovered, as gardeners are, not by calling his name, but by following the sound of a trowel striking soil with a certain judicial finality. He was a spare man, with a face the sun had pared down to essentials, and eyes that took in more than they chose to remark. When Poirot hailed him from the gravel path, he set his trowel aside with the respect one gives to both earth and visitor, and touched the brim of his hat. "You will forgive me," Poirot said, "if I ask you questions that sound foolish. It is my fate to be a fool until I am not." Pritchard's mouth twitched. "Reckon it's the same with roses, sir. They look a muddle till, all at once, they don't." "Just so. Yesterday, this awning." Poirot gestured to the striped canvas that threw its prim shade. "You see it often. You know its habits. Who had the little conversation with the cord?" "Cord don't talk much except to leave chalk," Pritchard said dryly. "But I see who pulls it, if that's what you mean. I were deadheading here at 10 to 4, and again at about 20 past. First time, it were raised up. Had been all day. Second time, it were half down. Someone had loosed it, and didn't make a meal of it either. Halfways for folks in a hurry." "You saw who did it?" Pritchard considered. "I saw a shadow move against the house. Not a big one. The sort as doesn't sit heavy, if you take me. Could have been the young lady, Miss Tolland. She walks light. But I didn't look up right then. I were pinching. When I did look up, the awning were halfway, as I say. And later, I saw Mr. Grant take a pull on it, round 4:30. He swore under his breath at the chalk, and got it all the way up again." Poirot's eyebrows composed a small, exact curve. "Ah, you are certain, the second time, of Monsieur Grant?" "I'm not a court, sir," Pritchard said, "but I know a man in town shoes when he's somewhere he'd rather not scuff. He had a look on him like the sun were his enemy." "Merci, mon ami. One more little thing. Yesterday, did anything in the air smell not as it usually does? The roses, they are profuse, but still." Pritchard's gaze went over the beds. "For a bit, no more than a breath, I thought of marzipan. Then I thought I were daft, because you don't get marzipan in a garden unless someone's dropped wedding cake. It were gone before I could say it twice in my head." "And when?" "Between the 2 times I told you. The clock in the hall struck the quarter, while I were thinking I were daft." Poirot thanked him with a gravity that belonged to a mass rather than a conversation, and walked back by the long route, feeling the measured press of the lawn underfoot. He paused on the terrace and looked up at the awning as a sailor looks at a sky that is pretending to be harmless. Inside, the library's square of sunlight had slipped away like a guest who does not wish to be observed. In its place lay the softened rectangle that the canvas provided, a shade that did not speak as boldly, and therefore, he thought, with more cunning. In Lockwood's room, Poirot asked Alder to assist him. The butler had laid everything with that particular scruple that makes even a dead man's brushes appear modest. Poirot did not rifle. He straightened. He aligned a shaving mug with its saucer, smoothed a tie that had suffered from its owner's temperament, and opened, with a nod of thanks from Alder, the top drawer where a silver cigarette case lay in patient expectation. It was handsome and vulgar at once, engine-turned, with a little clasp shaped like a scarab. Poirot opened it and breathed only with his eyes. "Il mélange," he said softly. "He who enjoys his own cleverness enjoys also variety. Turkish and Virginian in the same bed." He indicated the row, darker cylinders with golden papers, lighter ones with plain. One, third from the left, ever so slightly longer and aslant, as if someone had worked it out and put it back, forgetting the dictionary meaning of exactness. He did not touch. He asked instead for one of Lockwood's ashtrays, the one used yesterday if Alder could say, which Alder could, with the placid memory of a man who has polished his recollections as often as his silver. In its sand lay 3 truncated columns of ash, 2 pale, 1 darker. The darker had a half-formed cone that suggested it had been extinguished more briskly than smoked. "And Mr. Lockwood's lighter?" "On his person when the constable took him," Alder said. "Returned to me for safekeeping. It's in the small safe in my pantry." "Later," Poirot murmured, "we will let it keep company a little longer with the cold meats." His gaze, without appearing to leave the ashtray, glanced along the mantel. A matchbook, cheap, from a London hotel more fashionable than the matches suggested, lay there, one match torn away. Poirot placed it square and was content. When he came down the stairs, Sir Alister was waiting with a man who wore self-importance like an ill-cut suit. The inspector from the county town had arrived, brought by the scent of a bottle and the constable's zeal. He had the air of one who intends to organize the day into a list of arrests, beginning with the comforting capture of someone beneath him. "Mr. Poirot," he said at once, "we have the poison and we have the opportunity. The housekeeper will have to come along." Poirot looked toward Mrs. Hargreaves, who stood rigid, her large, capable hands clenched. Her dignity was a banner in a storm. "You have," Poirot said, "a bottle and a waste-bin. It is not the same thing as poison and a hand to wield it. But you will do as you think necessary, naturally. Only, if you arrest the housekeeper, do you not fear to please the murderer too much? He will be so grateful, the assassin. He may even congratulate you." The inspector, unused to being told that his satisfaction might be someone else's, bristled. "We shall let the coroner tell us what was in the gentleman, sir. Until then, precaution." "Precaution is commendable when it keeps people alive," Poirot said with a small bow. "When it merely irritates the innocent, it is less an officer and more an insect. For my part, I shall continue to observe." He turned away from the man with the sort of courtesy that is a dismissal, and asked Alder to bring coffee to the drawing-room, where he had, with a child's solemnity, arranged 4 chairs in an arc and left a 5th, slightly apart, angled not to the others, but to the door. They gathered once more. Grant came with the restlessness of a man who has postponed a race and cannot bear to think of those gaining on him. Lady Constance came with cheeks that were too fresh for the hour, Dr. Moreau with his small, precise hands folded, Iris with a quietness that was not submission, but attention. The inspector planted himself like a signpost and adopted a stance intended to be judicial. "I am tempted," Poirot said pleasantly, "to begin with the bottle, because bottles make a drama. But no, we begin with something very small. We begin with a cigarette." Grant made a movement of irritation that he converted to adjusting his cuff. Lady Constance's gaze flicked to the table and away. "Monsieur Lockwood," Poirot said, "smoked, like a man who believes that his own exhalations are applause. He had, in his case, 2 kinds, Turkish and Virginian. A connoisseur might know the difference by scent. A less subtle person would need to look. One of the cigarettes had been handled. Not smoked, handled. Its paper bears the faintest distortion at the mouth end, as if someone's fingers, not quite steady, had twisted and then smoothed." He looked not at Grant, who blazed, nor at Lady Constance, who arranged her face, but at Dr. Moreau. "Monsieur, you said yesterday there are substances that kill without leaving much in the way of theatre. If one wished to deliver such a thing without a glass, without a taste, one might paint the mouth of a cigarette with a very little dissolved salt of death. When the flame touched it, poof, the heat would carry it inward. The smoker would taste perhaps a bitterness he would attribute to novelty. He would grow still very quickly. He would, if he were sitting in a chair, look like a man asleep." The inspector gave an involuntary grunt. "You see? Poison." "Perhaps," Poirot said, as one says perhaps to a child who has identified a cow and wishes it to be the whole of agriculture. "But the idea is too pleasing, and when ideas please me too much, I distrust them. I mention it because it is one way. There are others, and whichever we choose, we must add one more element, the vanity of time. Someone wished to edit the hour of death. The awning moved down. Later, someone else, Monsieur Grant, our friend Pritchard says, moved it up again at 1/2 with chalk upon the fingers and impatience upon the mouth." Grant leaned forward, colour high. "I adjusted a blasted awning because the sun was in my eyes while I telephoned. Do you propose to make of that a gallows?" "I propose," said Poirot, "to make of it what it is, a man annoyed at the sun. It is not a sin, alas. It is merely human. But when we collect these human little things, we see the day as it was, not as someone would have it be. His gaze crossed to Lady Constance. Madame, you telephoned yesterday as well. Mrs. Hargreaves tells me that Mr. Lockwood had an interest in your calls. Lady Constance's chin lifted a fraction. He was a gossip. I spoke to my broker, if you must know. Like Mr. Grant, I dislike losing money on account of a corpse. Quelques-uns, Poirot said pleasantly, have lost fortunes on account of a corpse, but I do not think you are sentimental in that way. He let the jab smile. Mademoiselle Iris, when you fetched your music, you noticed the light. You are one who notices the shape of a square upon a carpet, the way a room sits in its own afternoon. You would not, no, move an awning halfway. You would either make a good job or leave it. That is what I think. Iris's eyes widened as if he had guessed the color of her secret favorite ribbon. Then she looked down and said, I cannot do things badly. It is a fault. It is a fault that becomes a virtue in detective work, Poirot answered, and his moustaches approved. Which leaves us a person who loves the gesture more than the craft, who makes half moves, who hopes to be admired for cleverness, and yet cannot finish a line straight. He let the sentence go no further. He took up his cup. He sipped. The inspector, who disliked vacuums, filled the room with his certainty. Mrs. Hargreaves will come with me, he announced to the air. We have to start somewhere. You may start where you please, Poirot said mildly. Only do not imagine you are also finishing there. He stood. Forgive me. I must trouble Alder for the lighter in his keeping in Mr. Lockwood's case. There is a very small experiment I must try. He had reached the door when Alder himself appeared, a man who rarely looked discomposed, and who now looked, within the carefully permissible degrees of butlerly concern, discomposed. Sir, he said to Sir Alister, then to Poirot, because it is wiser to say it to the man who will understand, the small safe where I placed Mr. Lockwood's lighter, it is open. I did not leave it so. And the lighter, sir, is gone. No one spoke for the space of a breath. Poirot turned back, and in that little quiet he placed his cup precisely upon its saucer. He had that air he sometimes had, as if the world had put a piece into his hand that he had not asked for, but which completed a corner he had already seen. Tiens, he said softly, when one removes the match from the book, one must also remove the book. When one takes the lighter, one tells me he has burnt a thing already, and intends to burn another. Or else... He looked not at the inspector, not at Grant, not at Lady Constance, but at the space above the empty chair angled to the door. Or else one has a fear of a very little smell that lingers on metal and cannot be persuaded to have no memory. The inspector found his voice first. This settles it, he declared with relief. That was almost gratitude, for action is a narcotic. We'll search rooms. You will do as you feel robust, Poirot said with courteous weariness, and I will do as I feel exact. He turned to Iris with a small inclination. Mademoiselle, would you be so good as to play to me this afternoon, in the library, at 4? Something with a rhythm one could set a watch to. It is good to have music when one listens to people trying not to make a sound. Iris nodded, bewilderment tempered by relief at being given a simple thing to do. She left with the others in a hush of speculations and offended prides. In the emptied room, Poirot stood quite still, looking at nothing, which is to say, he was looking at everything. Then, with a sigh that was not fatigue, but the release that follows confirmation, he went in search of Alder. When things are stolen in houses where nothing is stolen, he said, it is because someone has learned very suddenly that one tiny object is full of talk. Let us see which object was meant to be silenced, and whether it has already told me more than its thief imagines. Alder led him to the pantry, with an air of a man escorting a bishop through the scullery, respect mixed with foreboding. The small safe was set into the wall behind a curtain of green baize, the sort of modesty that only draws the eye. Alder knelt, opened the little door with clean, economical motions, and stepped back. "I closed it, sir," he said in a low voice, as if to speak louder would compromise the house further. "I believed I turned the key. The inspector had asked to see the lighter an hour ago. I took it out, then put it back. Mrs. Hargreaves called me to the door to say the constable wished to see the back staircase, and I must have left the key turned, but not withdrawn." "And when a door is not truly closed," Poirot said, "it is like a lie that is not properly told. It invites a finger." He leaned in. There were no scratches, no brutish marks of force. A faint smear of chalk near the keyhole suggested a hand that had also touched the awning cord. Who had the opportunity to be entire with the pantry in that little interval? Alder's mind produced a sequence as reliable as the hall clock. Rose, with a tray, Mrs. Hargreaves to fetch clean doilies, Jenner, Sir Alister's valet, to ask for more towels, Dr. Moreau, who requested a glass of water, and Lady Constance's maid, Vernon, with a message that her ladyship desired her vinaigrette. He paused. "Mr. Grant stood at the foot of the passage and asked me for the number of his broker. I wrote it and placed it by the hall telephone." "And Mademoiselle Iris?" "In the drawing-room, sir, practicing a Chopin she very kindly played last night," Alder said, with the faintest warmth that anyone who loves a well-run house has for a person who plays correctly. Poirot nodded. "The lighter, you said, was returned to you on the body, and before that, who handled it?" "Mr. Lockwood alone, to my knowledge." Alder's voice had a plain dignity. "We do not, sir, as a rule, examine the pockets of our guests when they are living." "Non, it would be an innovation." Poirot closed the safe, and this time turned the key himself, until it could go no further, then placed it in Alder's hand, and with a glance, made the instructions silent and absolute. "Now, I will trouble Mrs. Hargreaves. We comfort her, yes? We do not arrest her." He found the housekeeper in her room among the folded linen, standing sentinel over piles that would have shamed a military review. Her anger had cooled into something harder and more useful. She would not, she informed Poirot, be leaving her house in a policeman's handcart to gratify anyone's theatrical sense of justice. Poirot listened, nodded, and let the steam blow itself into the rafters. "Monsieur Lockwood had a sweet tooth?" he asked when she had finished. "He had a tooth for what was not his," Mrs. Hargreaves replied. "He took a peppermint from a dish in the hall yesterday, and said he preferred the sort that tastes of almonds. I told him we did not keep sweet shops at Greyfriars. Later," and here her brow gathered, "there was a smell near the scullery, just for a breath. I thought of Christmas cake. It went as quick as you like. And afterward, no bottle of scent missing, no curious vial in the dustbin until the constable found his prize?" "Until then, no," she said grimly. "The bin is under my eye. Since last night, it has been under a dozen eyes. If someone wanted a bottle found there, it was because someone wanted it found. I am used to people wanting things. It makes them careless." "It also makes them in a hurry," Poirot said, and bowed. "You are indignant, madame. Keep it. It will be useful." On his way back, the inspector intercepted him with a face flushed by purpose. He had telephoned the station, he said, and a man was on his way to take Mrs. Hargreaves in. He delivered this like news of a rescue ship, sighted at last. "You will do what you like," Poirot returned mildly. "But if you take the housekeeper away, you will empty the house of its memory. A murderer would be delighted." He passed on without waiting to see whether the notion would penetrate. In Lockwood's room, he stood a while before the dressing table, where Alder had made a symmetry out of a chaos. He did not touch the cigarette case. He let it sit, as a guest at a table is allowed to sit when the host suspects he is a bore. He picked up instead the book Lockwood had been reading when the living made way for the dead. It was one of his own poor tales, with a hero of improbable gall and a killer of theatrical flourish. At a page marked by the soft crease of a thumb, he found a passage underlined in pencil. The perfect murder leaves not a footprint, not a fibre, only the absence of something that should have been there. A shadow, perhaps, that did not fall. Poirot's mouth quirked not at the line, but at the vanity it revealed. Lockwood had been admiring himself. It had been his last approval. When he came downstairs, Sir Alister was at the bottom with Iris, who kept her hands folded, as if she had been told to sit very straight when anxious, and had not grown out of obeying. Sir Alister made to speak of the inspector. Poirot forestalled him with a small movement. "It will do as it must," he said. "Let it. Meanwhile, mademoiselle, at 4, as we agreed, you will play in the library, something with a march in it. Your Chopin, perhaps, is too romantic. A Bach. He is a clock with a soul." "I know a prelude," she said, relief pricking through her worry, and very briefly her face lit with the sober joy of someone permitted to do exactly what she can do well. "I will bring the metronome." "Parfait. I will bring the sun." Poirot's eyes went to Sir Alister. "You will indulge me in one more impoliteness. Put Mr. Lockwood's cigarette case on the little table by the French doors. In view. I wish to see who stares." Sir Alister half smiled despite himself. "You think your murderer will be tempted by tidiness?" "I think," Poirot said, "that he cannot bear a crooked picture. A crooked cigarette also will itch under his skin until he scratches." The inspector's man arrived, and there was the short, indecorous business of taking Mrs. Hargreaves to the station. She went with her head up, the set of her shoulders declaring that if this house were to be shamed, it would not be by her posture. Lady Constance found a lace handkerchief to press to a dry eye, and asked whether she should telephone her solicitor in case a person of standing were needed to sign something on behalf of poor Hargreaves. Lionel Grant made a point of being in no one's way and of notifying everyone of the fact. Dr. Moreau expressed regret in phrases that cost him no breath, and offered, delicately, to arrange for counsel if necessary. "And you, monsieur?" Poirot said, when the others had dispersed. "What did you do between 3:30 and 4:30 yesterday? You moved little, I think." Dr. Moreau's smile was the kind that sits in the face, like a well-trained guest. "I wrote a letter, read a little, and looked at your English sky. It is very flat," he said, almost apologetically, as if the sky might take the criticism personally. "Mr. Lockwood passed my door shortly after 3. He carried a book, and his own admiration." "He smoked." "He always smoked," Moreau said. "He lighted in the corridor and blew his first breath toward the ceiling, as if it were a fan." "For whom did he perform?" "For himself," Moreau said. He bowed, and in that bow there was a fatigue, not of body, but of seeing often where other people stop, because they do not like what the view shows. The house settled into the peculiar hush of later afternoon, the time when talk thins and shadows grow legs. At 5 minutes to 4, Iris entered the library, placed her metronome on the piano that stood modestly against the far wall, and set it moving with a small, decisive touch. The tick began, a thin, implacable beat, and the prelude took the room in hand. It ordered the air. It pared the edges off the nervousness that had been fraying since luncheon. Poirot sat not in the armchair, but on the terrace step, half outside, half in, so that the light made a clean diagonal across his shoes. Beyond him, the striped shadow of the awning lay precise and prim. Within, the little table bore its silver case like a shiny confession. He did not look at it. He looked instead at the glass of the French doors, which, when the light is exactly so, offers a picture that is truthful to each side. In it, he saw Iris's profile, and reflected over it, the slice of lawn where the croquet hoops threw upright lines like the bars of a small prison. He saw also, in those narrow inches, the people who passed behind him, thinking themselves unseen. Lady Constance came first, because those who must be seen cannot keep away from mirrors. She paused at the threshold and let the music wash her face into softness. Then her gaze slid toward the cigarette case and catching herself, away again, as a cat avoids the saucer when watched. She turned the metronome by one notch to make herself useful, and glided on. Grant crossed the terrace with the step of a man crossing a hostile boardroom. He stopped to take a call, changed his mind, pretended he had never intended to speak, and looked briefly in at the prelude, as if auditing it for value. His glance landed on the case, stuck a moment, and came away as from a price too high. He had chalk on his fingers still, a pale dust in the nail of the right index. Moreau came last, and almost did not come in at all. He stood at the far edge of the awning's shade, where the heat began to waver, and listened to 4 bars, with the grave attention one gives to a pulse. Then he stepped inside, moved to the window, and with a thoughtfulness that did not seek to be seen, lowered the curtain half a hand's breadth to cut a dazzle. The square on the rug blurred, the metronome clicked on, and in that little motion, Poirot saw the same mind that smooths a sheet, that aligns a scalpel, that does not tolerate irrelevant light. When the prelude ended, the silence after it felt like the held breath of a patient whose physician is considering a question no one else can hear. Poirot thanked Iris as if she had saved him a journey. He rose, turned, and only then let his eyes go to the little table. The cigarette case was not as it had been. The row within, which earlier had boasted its one tiny insubordination, the third from the left, set a hair's width longer, aslant as a quirk, now sat obediently in perfect formation. Someone had tidied what they did not own. Poirot stood very still. The temptation to smile was strong. He did not indulge it. He lifted the case delicately, as one would lift a face veil, and regarded the line a moment longer. The odd one had not been removed. It had been corrected. The foolishness of the murderer was not that he had tampered. It was that he could not bear an imperfection, even when he himself had made it. He closed the case, replaced it exactly, and turned to Alder, who had materialized as a decency in the doorway. "If you please, bring to me the ashtray from Mr. Lockwood's room, the one with the darker ash, and a clean glass." Alder went. Poirot walked to the fireplace, where the matchbook lay as he had left it, and balanced it square upon the mantel. He could feel, without turning, the attention at his back, Grant's impatience, Lady Constance's bright curiosity, Moreau's inwardness, Iris's steadiness. Alder returned with the ashtray. Poirot did not touch the ash. He did not light anything, for his thief had removed the means to satisfy that urge. He only held the glass over the sand and waited. It was nonsense, of course, but he wished to see who would stop him, who would laugh, who would say, "That will do nothing." No one spoke. In the absence, their faces said more than their tongues would have risked. "Merci," he said, and set the glass aside untouched. "You see, I make a magic, and nothing happens. That is the lesson our murderer wishes us to learn, that nothing happened. But the nothing is too arranged, too tidied. It troubles me. It is like a bed made twice." He let them go then. The scene closed without flourish. On the terrace steps, he found Pritchard again, standing with the stillness of a man who could stand all afternoon and call it work, because he is also listening to the roses. "There were ashes in the garden incinerator at 2, Pritchard observed without preface. "Mrs. Bridie burned potato peelings. I saw 'em. At 3:30, there were fresh ash on top, and no one burning kitchen slops. Smelled like someone had tried to burn hair from a brush. Sharp and nasty." "The wick of a lighter," Poirot said under his breath. "Bon, so he has charred his memory. He forgets the roses, remember." He went back into the library and stood once more in the seam of glass, where house and garden stitched together. On the table the case sat smug and symmetrical. In the grate the matchbook made its small, cheap boast. In the ashtray the darker cone waited like a finger that has almost finished pointing. He did not yet turn that finger. He looked instead at the door, and as lightly as one places a flower in a lapel, he set the next inch of the day where he wanted it. At dinner, he told Sir Alister when they met in the hall, "We will seat everyone by the window. We will have candles, though it is not dark. We will see who loves a shadow and who dislikes to cast one." "Another rehearsal?" Sir Alister asked, half exasperated, half grateful because order, even theatrical order, was easier to bear than chaos. "Mais oui," Poirot said, his eyes fond of the idea. "A last small one before we ask our audience to applaud." He touched the cigarette case in passing, with a finger so light it did not move the lid. "And if, before dinner, our little perfectionist cannot resist a second correction, Alder will be so kind as to do nothing at all." He glanced at the butler, whose impassivity shaded, just for a moment, into complicity. "Sometimes, my friend, the tidiest thing is to leave a thing alone and let the untidy reveal itself." Dinner at Greyfriars had the hush of an audience before the curtain. Alder had done as Poirot asked. The table was drawn out near the windows, so the last of the evening sat on the glass, and though the sky lingered in that pale English indecision between day and night, candles stood along the centre, tall, correct, superfluous, and therefore deliberate. The place cards were discreet. The napkins civilized the plates with a little flourish. The silver caught small flames and made of them a row of disciplined stars. Poirot arrived 2 minutes late by intention, and paused in the doorway long enough to let his eye take a census. Sir Alister presided with the stiff solicitude of a man whose house is behaving itself in public, while the family quarrels in the pantry. Lady Constance had chosen a seat that showed her profile to advantage against the window. She touched the stem of her glass as if it were an ally. Lionel Grant claimed the chair nearest the door to the hall telephone, as though even dinner must stand aside for his commerce. Dr. Moreau sat opposite the candles with the attention of a man who does not like competing lights. He turned his glass by a finger's width until twin flames within ceased to shiver. Iris Tolland was placed between Sir Alister and the doctor. Her dress was again the colour of temperate rain, and made the candlelight look richer for being invited to such restraint. Poirot's own seat was at the side, cinematically bad, and therefore good for a man who wished to watch. He sat, he fussed an unnecessary crease from his cuff, and in so doing noted the 3 small adjustments that matter. Lady Constance laid a bread knife an exact line from the plate, as if unprompted by anyone but symmetry. Grant shifted a candlestick 2 inches to his left, so that his shadow did not cross his soup. Dr. Moreau, with a small apology no one had asked for, snuffed one candle with wetted fingers and relit it so its wick burned clean. Iris did not touch anything. "There is a luxury," Poirot said as Alder poured, "in making an evening behave." He smiled as if at his own whimsy. "We forget how much of life is made orderly by very small tyrannies. The right curve of a spoon, the placing of a chair. I am a great tyrant in such matters. It is my confession." "Then you and I are cousins," Lady Constance returned lightly. "Both tyrants. Only you have a more amiable moustache." Grant, who did not enjoy being excluded from any conversation, said, "Tyrannies are very well in dining rooms. In markets, one prefers appetite." He wiped his fingers with a thoroughness that pushed chalk dust farther under his nail and did not know anyone saw. Dr. Moreau smiled without warmth. "Appetite and order. One must decide between them more often than one thinks." The soup gave way to the fish in a sequence that testified to Alder's reign. Poirot ate with genuine appreciation and an absent-mindedness that disguised it. Between courses, he asked questions that were domestic and ungentlemanly in their persistence, but he dressed them as gossip. Lockwood's cigarettes, what of them? Lady Constance wrinkled her nose and declared them theatrical. Grant shrugged and called them cheap bravado in an expensive case. Moreau observed that smoke is the universal symbol, for a man who does not know what to do with his hands. "And yesterday," Poirot said, "who noticed him light one at 3 o'clock by the sun?" "Everyone noticed him," said Lady Constance. That was his profession. Moreau is right, Grant added. The smoke announced him like a bugle. Iris was quiet until Poirot made a show of being disappointed that she had not contradicted anybody. She coloured and said in her careful, unshowy way, "He stood by the corridor mirror and watched himself blow the first smoke. He tilted his head as though he were being painted. He liked the line of it." Poirot raised his glass to her, as one salutes an exact observation. "You give me a truth that costs you nothing," he said. "It is generous." He set the glass down and drew one candlestick nearer to him, the thickness of a thumbnail. It shifted the dance of everyone's shadows. Grant's retreated from his plate. Lady Constance's profile dipped into light and became suddenly mortal. Dr. Moreau's grew longer and thinner and lay its attenuated face upon the cloth. Iris's remained what it had been, modest, correct, uninterested in occupying space that was not hers. Poirot let the new geometry sit, then, as if bored with his own game, moved the candle back. Between the fish and the roast, the inspector entered, less a man than a decision wearing boots. He said he would not take a seat, he would not have soup, he would not, in short, be human, and then proceeded to be very human indeed by announcing he had been vindicated. The lighter, or what remained of it, had been found among the ash of the garden incinerator. Pritchard, with a gardener's contempt for anything that does not grow, had prodded the heap and come up with a warped metal cap and the charred stump of a wick soldered to it. "Found at your incinerator, Sir Alister," the inspector said, with a relish he tried to restrain. "Incriminating as you please. The staff use it. The housekeeper oversees it. What do we conclude?" "That potato peelings promote combustion?" Poirot suggested mildly. "Sit down, Inspector. You are making the candles nervous." "I'll stand," the man said, but he stayed long enough to put the hard little trophies on a side plate where they looked indecent among the crystal. Lady Constance flinched prettily. Grant drew breath through his teeth and expelled it as if it had cost him something. Dr. Moreau leaned to examine the cap with a professional absence of disgust. "If I may," he said, and the inspector, vaguely daunted, because men who can write prescriptions are a class of magician, allowed him. Moreau turned the blackened wick between his fingers and then set it down, and when he wiped his fingers on his napkin, he did it with a man's carefulness who has learned that some stains, once acquired, do not leave easily. "Eh bien," Poirot murmured, "we have the remains of a thing that has been made to forget itself. It is like a witness who has been taught a false statement and repeats it even in sleep." The inspector went away satisfied that he had thickened his case to porridge. The dinner found its temperature again. Poirot did not appeal to anyone to be reasonable. He allowed the returns to find their own little circle. Talk of the city for Grant to pronounce upon. Talk of oysters for Lady Constance to pretend she had never heard the less respectable folklore. Talk of clinics for Dr. Moreau to deflect with exact anecdotes that possessed all the detail and none of the colour of the original. Iris spoke only when addressed, and then with that clarity that makes people sorry they were not clever enough to ask her something better. When the roast had been cleared, Alder carried in the coffee service with its scent that is both comfort and alarm. Poirot's eyelids drooped in pleasure, and then lifted a degree because pleasure ought to be watched. He stood, and in doing so, placed himself where the tray must pass him. He did not touch the pot. He did not sniff the cups as stage detectives do. He watched Alder measure, watched the steady hand, watched the spoon descend to sugar and rise again, and because he had asked earlier that sugar lumps be replaced with granulated, an impertinence whose usefulness he had not explained, he also watched the smallest pause before Alder realized that the bowl's habit had changed. "Pardon?" Alder murmured to the room, as if to the air. "We are out of lumps this evening." "Très bien," Poirot said unexpectedly. "Then everyone will sweeten twice, no? For novelty?" He was looking at no one. He was looking at the fact that novelty makes honest men pause and guilty men decide in a hurry. Lady Constance accepted her cup and her novelty with a laugh. Grant said he took his black and then added sugar anyway, because some contrariness in him could not resist a contrary. Dr. Moreau declined sugar, as if declining a seduction. Iris stirred once and set her spoon down exactly in the center of the saucer, where the handle did not touch china at an angle, but lay like a tiny compass aligned to north. Poirot did not drink. He set his cup aside with a little apology to the coffee, as if he and it had a private understanding to meet in the morning. He let the talking arrange itself into pairs, then cut it with one remark that was almost nothing. "It is curious," he said. "Yesterday there was talk of a smell like marzipan. People remembered it only after they learned that such a smell attends a certain death. Today I smell nothing, and yet the fear in the house is stronger. It is like a perfume someone is wearing under their clothes." Lady Constance made a face. "I dislike the smell of almonds," she said promptly. "It always seems theatrical." "Some perfumes," Dr. Moreau said, "proclaim themselves to conceal their purpose. Others conceal themselves to proclaim it. One sees it in human beings, too." "Do you know," said Grant dryly, "I could do with a brandy that proclaims itself." "You shall have it," Sir Alister said, grateful for any task that could be accomplished, and signalled Alder, who moved with pleasure at being allowed to restore the evening to something like the diagram in his head. When the brandy came, when the coffee cooled undrunk before 3 places and vanished from 2, when the candles had guttered twice and been trimmed once, Poirot rose. "Forgive me," he said, "a small discourtesy. I must borrow Iris." He led her back to the library, where the air had the temperature of unsaid things. The cigarette case still sat on the table by the French doors, because Alder, possessing the rare courage to do nothing, had left it where it troubled someone. The room received them with the patience of a place that has seen less and more. "Play to me a minute," Poirot said softly. "Something with corners in it." She played back again, and as she played, he went about the room with a small book of paper matches he had slipped from the mantel earlier. He did a very foolish-looking thing. He struck a match and held it 3 inches above the ashtray, where the darker cone sat. The flare burned down. He shook it out. He lit another. He blew. He attended to the tiny winds in the room as a fisherman attends to small currents. On the 3rd match, when the air at last, sulkingly, admitted the barest ghost of something bitter under the human smells of polish and flowers and wood, he looked up. Iris had stopped of her own accord. "Do you smell it?" he asked. She hesitated, as if afraid of being made to be mistaken. "A little," she said, "like old cake, only not sweet. Exact." He put the matchbook down where the thief of the lighter might have to look at it, and then not dare to touch. "It is nothing, you understand, less than nothing, but it is stubborn. It stays where the murderer would rather it did not. He is a man who fears scents, because they are not rational. He tidies what he can see. He cannot tidy air." "You think it is a man?" she said. "I think," Poirot replied, "it is a person who tidies as if the world were a patient under his care, and he its physician." He glanced toward the windows, where the night had finally made up its mind to exist. "We will see quite soon whether he believes in shadows." They returned to the drawing-room for the last civility of the evening. Alder had dimmed the lamps to a politeness. The candles were allowed to die with ceremony. The windows were wide, and in the glass their little company was doubled in that way that admits both truth and artifice. Faces inside, night outside, and between them their reflections that could be made to agree with either, if one angled one's head. Poirot placed himself where the pane would show him everyone's choice, who stepped nearer to see themselves in the dark, who stepped back to avoid the intimacy. He saw Lady Constance lean forward, as one does to check whether the lipstick has been loyal. He saw Grant take the quickest glance and then look past himself to the lawn as if futures could be read on grass. He saw Iris look, and then, because she was good, look away to give privacy to the others. He saw Dr. Moreau locate the exact point where he stood behind the candle's line and cast no shadow upon the glass at all. It was a small thing, the sort of thing a tidy mind does without knowing. It was also a thing a man would practice if he had wanted once before to leave no shadow. Poirot's eyes warmed without softening. He had not yet closed his hand, but his fingers had learned this murderer's size. He let the evening end. He thanked the house, which is to say Alder, for its obedience to order. He said good night to the guests with the beautiful egality of a priest who knows all sins and blesses all equally. And when he was alone on the landing, he stood with his hand on the banister and looked down the well of the staircase where rotors of lamps made islands of light. From below, faint as if embarrassed, there came the smallest chime. The hall clock remarked the half-hour, and with it, somewhere in the house, a door closed very carefully. It was not the pantry. It was not the kitchen. It was the small room off the library that Sir Alister used as a writing closet, the room that held, among less important papers, the duplicates of every telegram sent from Greyfriars in the last month. Bon, Poirot said to the wood and the light and the faithful gravity. When one leaves no shadow, one leaves a draught. He took the last 3 steps down with an old man's fastidiousness and a hunter's quiet, and walked toward the place where neatness had gone to tidy away the final dangerous scrap. Poirot did not hurry. He went by way of the long passage where the carpets had learned the habits of every foot, and where the lamps kept a polite distance from each other, so that there were islands of light and little straits of dimness between. The small writing closet opened from the library like a reticent thought. Its door stood shut now, in that particular way doors have when they have only just been closed, air still stirring about the jamb. He rested the tips of his fingers on the panel, then turned the knob and entered, as a guest enters a chapel, with permission presumed because he intends no harm. The room was orderly to insolence, Sir Alister's order, Alder's maintenance. A narrow desk, pigeonholes labelled in Alder's precise hand, a wall calendar with a pencil looped to it, a box for duplicates of telegrams sent, and, on the deep sill, a single square of the night let in by a casement hardly unlatched. The faintest breath crossed the paper on the desk and made it lift and fall like a creature asleep. Poirot stood very still and let his eyes become curious in the way of a man who has looked at many tidy rooms and knows how they speak when something has been asked of them in haste. The pigeonhole marked "Telegram Duplicate. Last 14 days" showed a small disobedience. The topmost slip skewed a finger's breadth to the right. Beneath, there was a space thinner than a wafer, where something had been, and was no longer. Beside the blotter, a brass ashtray held a little sickle of charred paper, no bigger than a fingernail. It was new ash, Pritchard's kind that still remembers its former shape, and the smell in the closet was not the stale faintness of old tobacco, but the prim, acrid whisper of paper just touched by flame and pinched out. He opened the drawer where Sir Alister kept his correspondence paper, and found, as he had expected, a messenger's pad with a cardboard back that had been used for writing the telegram forms before they went into their envelopes. He lifted the top sheet and saw the indentations, the ghost of words pressed through by a firm hand. He did not sigh, because satisfaction is a luxury, and he had other work to do. He merely took Sir Alister's old red and blue pencil, shaded lightly across the paper until the grooves accepted the graphite and gave him back their secrecy. It was an old trick, and a ridiculous one, and it worked as it nearly always does when neat men lean too hard upon their self-control. The words came up as if admitted to a club. Felix M., alias Morand, struck off. Marseille, 1921. Proof arrives Sunday. J.L. The pencil paused. Poirot looked at the little initial on the end and saw Jasper Lockwood's vanity nod from its grave. He shaded the line again to be certain, and then, without taking the sheet, he tore the corner with the words free of the page as neatly as one tears a check. It was not theft, it was rescue. He returned the pencil to its loop, aligned the telegram slips exactly as they had not been aligned, and closed the drawer. On the way out, he latched the casement, for a draft may be a clue, but it is no benefit to a library. In the passage, Alder appeared with that disconcerting talent of his for being already where he was wanted. Poirot raised a hand, and the butler stopped without question. "Someone has paid a visit to Sir Alister's pigeonholes," Poirot said, in a voice that made the statement part of housekeeping, rather than scandal. "We will let the room sleep. Only, let Pritchard keep his ear upon this stretch of corridor. Gardeners hear smoke when it is only yet a thought." "Very good, sir," Alder said. He did not ask what had been taken. A well-run house leaves questions until the right person is ready to answer. At the angle of the hall, Dr. Moreau emerged from the drawing-room as a man might from a consideration. He had no brandy in his hand. He had, instead, the look of one who has admired a candle longer than it needed, and has told it so with a sigh. He saw Poirot, and offered the small bow by which reasonable men acknowledge each other after a day that has tired them. "You are not sleeping, monsieur?" Poirot asked softly. "I sleep badly with questions in the air," Moreau replied. "One picks them up in the morning like soot." His voice was without complaint. He did not look away. He was very good at not looking away. "You are from Marseille?" Poirot asked, mild as milk. A beat, the space of a metronome's click. "From Lyon," Moreau said. "I worked in Marseille a year, long ago." "Marseille is a city that leaves a taste," Poirot observed. "Some call it salt, some something more medicinal." Moreau's mouth accepted this, and made of it an agreeable line. "You have travelled widely, Monsieur Poirot." "Enough to know that the air remembers." Poirot inclined his head, and let the phrase go past the doctor like a leaf on a stream. "Bonsoir, monsieur." He did not look back to see if Moreau watched him go. He already knew. The inspector intercepted him next, with a blunt, exhausted eagerness. He had secured his trophies, arranged his witnesses, and now required the permission of success. "We've sent the housekeeper down," he announced. "She's not to be held overnight if the doctor says she's fit, but I'll have her statement neat by morning." The word neat pleased him. He repeated it. "You will also have, if you send a boy now to the telegraph office, neat copies of all messages sent from Greyfriars in the last month," Poirot said, as if giving a housewife a recipe that will save her time. "It will spare you surprises. You may find, for instance, that a certain hydrocyanic acid was ordered last week for the orchard. Wasp jars, Inspector. Your country houses hate wasps. And the bottle in Mrs. Hargreaves's bin ceases to be an evil, and becomes merely an object that a murderer has found convenient." He did not wait for the man's face to darken. He added, almost kindly, "You will also find a telegram sent by Monsieur Lockwood to his editor at 2 in the afternoon yesterday. You will not find one of his duplicates in Sir Alister's closet. Such paradoxes make life rich." The inspector's jaw worked as a jaw works when a man suppresses the desire to argue, because he has the sense to see he will only be given a schooling. "We'll fetch what we can fetch," he said, and went away with frustration, marching behind him like a small dog. Poirot climbed a single flight and stood for a moment at the turn of the stair, listening to the house pronounce itself, room by room. A door closed at the end of the guest corridor with the same carefulness as before. It was a sound with no guilt in it, merely the footfall of a tidy mind. He let it be, and went down again to the library, where the candles were out, and the dark had made the French doors into 2 soft mirrors. He placed the little torn square with its resurrected words inside his pocketbook behind a calling card, and was about to leave when the air changed. almost imperceptibly, a ribbon of smoke's thought rather than smoke. He spoke once, only a name. Alder. Alder came like a servant in a conjuring trick, and did not ask how he had been called. Poirot pointed. The smell was not much. It was enough. They reached the writing closet together, and opened the door upon a neatness that had been offended, and was attempting to retaliate. A sheet of paper burned in the ashtray with an ungenerous flame. Alder had a cloth upon it before it could protest. Poirot shut the casement that had been edged open again. The ash surrendered with a sulk. On the grate there was the faintest glisten, a smear that the cloth lifted and left behind its ghost. Not wax, not tallow, the shy, sour cleanness of a spirit that dries too quickly. Ether, Poirot said. A very little. One might keep it in a bag among instruments to pretend it is there for anesthesia, but it is very good at giving a flame ambition. Alder's face did not change, which is a thing few faces can boast when something in a house chooses to burn. Sir Alister will like it ill that anyone lights paper in here. Sir Alister will like it less if anyone burns what he must see, Poirot answered. He coaxed the char free, and found that it had been no more than the corner of an envelope that bore no address now worth reading. You will be so good as to ask Pritchard to sit upon the bench outside this door with a damp sack, as if he were a gargoyle. He will not stir unless there is a sound of paper or a smell of Christmas. And tell him that the first person who comes with a very good reason to fetch anything from this room is to be told, with respect, that the room has retired for the night. Alder withdrew to make these arrangements with the quiet zeal of a man promised a siege. Poirot remained and looked at the place where the paper had burned. He saw, as he had hoped, the little cinder of a postage stamp stuck to the grate by a smear of softened gum. He lifted it delicately with his fingernail and smiled at its colour. French. He set it upon the desk blotter to cool, and when it had, folded it into his pocket-book with the torn, pencilled words. He went at last, not because there was nothing more to see, but because the person who wanted to see again would be made to show himself by wanting. In the drawing-room, Iris sat with her hands in her lap, listening to the remains of the evening, as if to the end of a record. She looked up when Poirot entered, and gave him a look that avoided making anything dramatic of her own steadiness. "There will be no more playing tonight, mademoiselle," he said gently. "Bach has done all the cleaning that can be done." She smiled at that. Then, because she was herself, she added, "Doctor, Moreau does not sleep." "Many do not," Poirot said. "He walks without making a sound," she said after a moment. "I heard him go past my door after the inspector left, and again just now. He stopped near the railing. He always stops at the exact place where the lamp does not throw a shadow. When I was a girl and poor, I learned exactly where to stand to be overlooked. He stands there without thinking." "It is very useful to be unseen," Poirot agreed. "It is useful when one wishes not to be a person, but a figure." He left her then with that poor comfort, and found the inspector again, because it is better to trouble a man once with two truths than twice with one. He told him, briefly, of the orchard fumigation order, and the likelihood that the bottle in the bin would be found to have had a practical life before it became theatrical. He told him also that he, Poirot, had requested from the office in the village duplicates of all their sent telegrams. They would come in the morning, and when they came, the inspector would find that Mr. Lockwood had been writing to London less about novels than about people. He did not say which people. The inspector's expression tried several arrangements and chose, at last, a grudging patience. The house was done by then with its noises. Even the clocks consented to be quiet for a little while. Poirot stood in the library a last time, looking at his little exhibits, the cheap matchbook upon the mantel, the silver cigarette case with its now obedient row, the ashtray with its lone darker cone, and then went to his room with a motion like a man laying out his clothes for morning. He did not sleep long. At dawn, when the birds had the bad manners to begin, before the light had the decency to arrive, he was at the window, watching the lawn become a colour again, and the terrace grow its own shadows, with the same precision as a ledger grows figures. He thought of the words he had lifted. Morin, struck off, Marseille. He thought of a man who loves to correct a crooked thing, even when the crookedness is his own doing. He thought of air made to carry a little death without a glass, and of the ridiculous courage it takes to trust sunlight more than clocks. When Alder knocked with the tray, it bore, in addition to the coffee, a thin blue envelope with the village stamp and the officious air peculiar to messages that believe themselves to be important. Poirot broke it and read the copies from the office. Sir Alister's summons to him, Lady Constance's brisk little chatter with her broker, Lionel Grant's habitual orders, all appetite and arithmetic, Iris Tolland, none, Dr. Moreau, one, a week ago in French, to a private address in London that even the clerk had not been able to spell without help. Bon, Poirot said to the envelope. We will give to our friends this morning a breakfast at 9, earlier perhaps than they have planned, and afterwards we will take the Sun at its word. He took his coffee, and because he loved order more when it had made itself useful, placed the cup precisely upon its saucer and allowed himself the smallest smile. Today, he told the quiet room, we will see who can bear to stand in the light and cast a shadow he cannot correct. Breakfast was at 9 by Poirot's decree, and the house obeyed because, for a morning at least, to be told what to do was a kindness. The dining room had the clean brightness of a day that has not yet sinned. Alder poured coffee as if it had been ordained, and the eggs presented themselves with the crisp humility of things properly timed. Sir Alister looked older by daylight, which is to say more himself. Lady Constance wore gaiety like a veil, and allowed it to slip when she believed no one was looking. Lionel Grant read the financial page while eating, as though profit could be summoned by mastication. Dr. Moreau attended to his knife and fork, with that grave simplicity good hospitals teach. Iris took what was given to her, and made no conversation carry more weight than it could bear. Poirot came in with the post. He had already opened the blue envelope from the telegraph office, and placed, beneath his napkin, the clerk's dutiful copies. He let breakfast be breakfast, then he let information be air. There is a little housekeeping, he said when Alder withdrew. First, the orchard. Your wasp jars will be very formidable this summer, Sir Alister. Hydrocyanic acid ordered last week from Bates and Lacey, 2 bottles, to be used with care and gloves. The clerk, who loves a good garden, remembers your coachman carried the crate himself, so we do not tie poor Mrs. Hargreaves to that bottle in her bin as if it were a millstone. We cut the cord, and she floats. Sir Alister expelled a breath that civilized men do not call relief. Lady Constance said, I told the inspector it would be something like that, with the confident retrospect of those who have been wrong. Grant looked at his toast, as if betrayed by it. Dr. Moreau inclined his head the merest degree. Iris's fork, which had paused, moved on. Second, Poirot continued mildly, the telegraphs. We have your summons to me, Sir Alister, Madame Constance's economies, Monsieur Grant's appetites, which are athletic, Mademoiselle Iris, none, and Monsieur le Docteur, one, in French, a week ago, addressed to a private room in London. R, no surname. The clerk, who cannot spell French without whistling, recalls you assisted him. Moreau's expression did not change enough to count as a change. I have patients who travel, he said. We correspond in my mother tongue when we can. But naturally, Poirot agreed, and did not add that the clerk had admired the neatness of Moreau's letters as they formed, the calm press of his hand. Last, a message sent from this house yesterday at 2 by Monsieur Lockwood, to an editor in London, but this is only the cover, and to Marseille. The second asked for an answer at once. The village office confirms a reply was handed in at their counter just after 8 this morning. It is on its way by the next motor with the postman's knees. It will be here before luncheon. The message reads." He lifted his napkin, and with a finger edged the copy into view without showing it. "That Morand, struck from the rolls in 1921, alias known, papers to follow Sunday." The noise that followed was not a noise. It was a small withdrawal of air, as if the room did not wish to be present at what it had heard. Lady Constance put down her spoon with a chime that was not entirely under control. Grant turned his paper over and found, as men do at such moments, nothing printed suited his needs. Sir Alister looked at Poirot with dislike that was meant for fate. Iris, who had not been prepared for this kind of morning, folded her hands in her lap so that they would not be foolish. Dr. Moreau buttered his bread lightly and then set the knife down so exactly aligned with the plate that Alder, entering, paused, because he had never before seen his own impulse done for him. "Morand is a common name in France," he said. "To be struck off. This happens to good men, and bad for reasons that will not concern an English breakfast. If Mr. Lockwood was writing a little scandal for his little readers, he is beyond correction now. I do not answer to his shade." "He was not a ghost at 2 o'clock, Poirot said without warmth. "He asked for proof. Proof has taken the diligence. It will arrive in time for Sunday, but for us—" he looked through the window where the lawns had agreed to be beautiful. "For us, this morning is enough. At 11, you will be so good as to indulge me again in a small theatre. Come as you are, bring only your shadows. I shall bring the sun." It was a thing to laugh at, so Lady Constance laughed. No one joined her. Between breakfast and 11, the inspector knocked with the zeal of a man whose certainties have been scolded. He had news that was already old. Poirot gave him the new news. There was some mutter about French addresses and the impertinence of village clerks. Poirot let him keep his mutter. He had grown, overnight, a shade more cautious, which is the beginning of wisdom in policemen and the affliction of financiers. At 5 minutes before the hour, the library was arranged, not as it had been the day before, but as it must be to tell the truth. The awning was furled, the French doors stood open. The small table with the cigarette case sat just inside the threshold at the left. The armchair was where the square of light would presently visit and then abandon. Pritchard, already a piece of furniture when he chose, located himself on the terrace step, where his eyes could see everything and professed to see nothing. The ink smell of the writing closet had been replaced by Alder's faint empire of beeswax. The casement in that little room was now obedient. On the mantel, the cheap matchbook had been replaced exactly where it had sulked. The ashtray held its 3 small columns, 2 pale, 1 dark, like 3 moralities forced into a row. They came, obedient to curiosity, and to the kind of politeness that is really strategy. Poirot placed them where he wished them. "Stand there, madame. No, a little back of the pane so the glass does not flatter you. Monsieur Grant at the door. Sir Alister, if you please, where a host naturally would be. Mademoiselle by the piano. Thank you. Monsieur le Docteur, here by the bookcase." He looked at the clock. It agreed to be 1:15. The sun, which had its professional pride by now in this room, struck the carpet in a clean rectangle and then lay down. Poirot walked into the square and out of it, as a man shows a new dog the limits of a garden. "You see," he said as if to children, "we have 2 clocks. One ticks, one shines. Yesterday someone attempted to persuade the sun to lie. She does not. She only sulks when curtained, and becomes, as Pritchard says, half-minded. If a chair stood here at 20 past, the leg would draw a pen stroke of shade. If it does not, then either the leg or the sun has been meddled with. I, who have a sentiment for celestial propriety, accuse the human." He shifted the chair till its foot cut the light. The bar fell as if obeying a command. He left it so and stepped back. "Now we watch whose fingers itch." He talked then in a way that sounded like wandering, and was not. He spoke of Lockwood's taste for what was not his, of his habit to look at himself when he performed, of his letter to Marseille. He told a quiet joke about authors who underline their own epigrams as if they required rehearsals. He mentioned, oh so absent-mindedly, that ether leaves a clean smell that is like an apology, and that to burn paper in a room one must open a casement a mere finger's breadth to give it ambition. And while he talked, he watched the square. Lady Constance shifted once, and then remembered to be beautiful. Grant kept his hands in view, as if cross-examined by light. Sir Alister's restlessness trapped itself genteelly in his pocket-watch. Iris stood without angling her body toward escape or display. Only Dr. Moreau made a small, almost invisible move. He took a half-step forward to put himself just so in relation to the pane, so that his reflection, which had been full in the glass, ceased to be doubled by the sun, and became only the one he permitted. The chair leg's bar of shadow touched the hem of his trouser, and he lifted his foot half an inch, as if the light irritated him where it crossed the cloth. Voilà, Poirot said gently. It is a habit, is it not, to cast only the shadows one chooses? Moreau did not colour. He did not begin to deny. We are all creatures of habit, Monsieur Poirot, he said quietly. You perhaps prefer your knives aligned. And my truths, Poirot returned. He let the air rest for a count of 4. You knew Jasper Lockwood from before, monsieur, not as a friend, as a man who pried. He wrote to Marseille. Marseille wrote back. He would have shown his editor. He would have published something. Without understanding it, you came to Greyfriars. By invitation, yes, but with necessity in your suitcase. Here was a man who would make a drama of a past you had spent years making tidy. You could not bear untidiness. Untidiness kills men, Moreau said with a sudden force that was not anger, but conviction. In operating theatres, in wards, in whole cities when the drains are wrong and the air is bad. If I put a scalpel down at an angle, a child dies. Do not preach to me of tidiness, as if it were vanity. It is immoral. And yet, Poirot said softly, what you did in this room was vanity. It was the vanity that says, they will admire, they will not see. You thought to write the hour with the awning, and when another hand, Monsieur Grant, lifted it for his telephone, you must write again. You tidied what you had done when you saw that I had noticed. You corrected the cigarette you had corrected. He moved to the small table and opened the case with delicacy. Yesterday, one cigarette sat a little proud. This morning, after Aunt Bac played, someone who cannot leave a picture crooked, set it even. The mouth end bears the faintest varnish where a solution once dried. See? He did not offer it to them. He held it in his palm as a vicar holds a wafer. You painted death where a man puts his lips, believing the flame would carry it inward without witness. He lit from his own lighter. The wick learned your secret. Later you stole the lighter, burned it, and burned also the corner of a letter that had crossed the sea. Ether tells me what water would have concealed. Moreau's face altered then, not into panic, but into a sadness that had been waiting. You speak as if I were a melodrama, he said. Monsieur Poirot, in Marseille I signed a paper. It was politics disguised as ethics, a superior with a friend, a mistake with an enemy. I changed my name because one does not fight city halls in 2 countries at once. I have done no harm here. You have done this harm, Poirot said, and looked at the armchair. You have made of a stupid, vain man a corpse. You have given to Mrs. Hargreaves a night in a cell. You have given to Sir Alister a house that will be spoken of for a year. To avoid a shadow, you have put out a light. Moreau's gaze, which had not fled once, went past Poirot to the square on the rug. It had slid, obedient. The chair's bar of shade had lengthened like a pen writing the hour. His mouth softened in the way of a man who has finished an operation he should not have begun. I did not mean to move time, he said, only to use it. He died at 20 past. He made a remark to himself after the first draw, that the new Turkish were bitter, and he smiled at it, as if admiring his own line. He died as carelessly as he had lived. Grant's chair grated back a fraction. "You hear him?" he demanded of the heir. "He admits, and yet he argues. Inspector?" "Non," Poirot said without raising his voice. "We do not yet gather in a sack. We give our net a last weight." He looked at Moreau again. "You will say you wish to prevent harm to patients, to yourself, perhaps even to someone you once loved. You will say Lockwood would have lied. Perhaps. There is one truth only I require. When you painted the cigarette, did you do so in this room with the doors open to the roses, or in the corridor where the air does not betray? Because Pritchard, who loves his garden, says there was for one moment a marzipan that did not belong to June." "In the corridor," Moreau said automatically, because men who love precision cannot help answering a question exactly. "I am not a fool." The instant the sentence existed, he shut his mouth as if it had bitten him. "And yet," Poirot said almost tenderly, "you are a fool, because you believe that if one avoids a shadow, the act disappears. Mademoiselle Iris, who plays Bach with a conscience, saw you last night choose your place at the window so the candle would not put your outline on the glass. I saw you a moment ago evade the bar of the chair as if it were a stain. You believe in control. Alas, mon ami, the sun is older than you." The door to the writing closet opened without drama, and Aldous spoke with that extreme courtesy he keeps for ugly moments. "Sir, the post," he said, "from the village, addressed to Mr. Lockwood, but redirected by the telegraph on your instruction." He brought a single envelope, official, French, with that stamping that announces bureaucracy like a trumpet. "Pardonnez," Poirot murmured, and broke it. He read enough and folded the paper, exactly. "The Conseil de l'Ordre," he said, and looked up. "They apologize for delay. They confirm that Félix Morand was removed in 1921 for cause, that he has since practiced under another name in England, and that copies of the papers are en route. They will be here tomorrow." He did not look at the inspector, who stood very straight, as if his spine were being observed by a superior. He spoke again to Moreau. "It was not a lie, then. It was an old truth you could not afford." Moreau's shoulders dropped not much and entirely. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, and the liquid French of his voice deepened, "you have what you came for. I will not run. I have no talent for mess." Poirot's face altered too, into that particular sadness that sits well with men who love order because they know what disorder costs. "We will speak again in an hour," he said gently. "All of us. In the drawing-room. It will be more comfortable. For now, Inspector, you will behave with intelligence. You will keep him where he is comfortable and watched by Alder, who is the best warder living. You will not put irons upon his dignity to appease a newspaper that has not yet been printed." The inspector, unexpectedly teachable, nodded once. "An hour," he said to the air, and it sounded like a prayer. People drifted as people do when the floor has fallen a little, and no one wishes to look into the space. Lady Constance's hand trembled, and she hid it by adjusting the ornaments that did not require adjusting. Grant found himself a telephone call, perhaps to convince the exchange that he was still the person he had been at 8. Sir Alister walked into his own house as if it were unfamiliar and therefore rude. Iris stood by the piano, looking at the square of light that was leaving the carpet. Her face was not triumphant. It was, instead, very quiet. Poirot touched the cigarette case as he passed. It sat prim as a row of teeth in a smile. "There is one more thing," he said over his shoulder, to the room rather than to any person. "The murderer left no shadow, but he left a draught. In 1 hour, mes amis, we close the window." The hour did not pass so much as dilate, like glass warmed by breath. The house made those little noises that accompany waiting, spoons that reflect no appetite, doors that discover hinges, a clock that becomes aware of its own conscientiousness. Poirot spent 10 minutes writing 2 brief notes, and 10 more walking the long corridor with the even step of a man who makes the floor remember his pace. When he stopped, it was not because the hour was done, but because the air had taken on that pressure which tells a room that people are about to enter it with their faces arranged. They came to the drawing-room first, because drawing-rooms are where English crises begin their courtesies. Alder had behaved as a diplomat, lamps low, curtains wide, chairs set in a modest amphitheatre that suggested conversation rather than judgment. The inspector stood near the chimney-piece with a caution that had learned humility in one night. Sir Alister looked like a man who has discovered his house contains a mirror he had not commissioned. Lady Constance brought with her a perfume that pretended to be insouciance and failed. Lionel Grant wore the sort of composure that is kept in a safe and brought out with the good watch. Iris sat at the arm of a chair and kept her hands together as if they were a sentence that must not be interrupted. Dr. Moreau entered last and did not appear to notice that Alder had, by a courtesy of genius, placed a table between his chair and the door. Nothing to trip a man, merely a reminder that furniture can, when it wishes, have a conscience. Poirot did not begin with a speech. He began by shutting a window. Not the French doors, those he left open to the lawn and its indifferent morning, but the small sash above the bookcase, which Alder had tilted an inch to make the air amiable. Poirot lowered it with 2 fingers until the catch settled with a click as soft as a scent. "Pardon," he said to the room. "There is a draught. It is a small thing, a nothing, but it changes how the flame behaves." No one spoke, and because no one spoke, the quiet made its own invitations. Poirot took the chair that let him look at each face in turn, and did not yet look at any of them. He placed on the table 3 objects, as one lays a hand of cards without flourish: the cheap matchbook from the mantel, the little blackened cap and fragment of wick from the incinerator, and a folded slip of blue, one of the telegraph copies. "You do not need, mes amis, for me to tell you that Jasper Lockwood loved to be watched," he said at last. "He wrote to be watched, he smoked to be watched, he died watched, by sunlight, which is the most pitiless audience. You have indulged me in rehearsals because I wished to see, with my little grey cells, how this room performed. It has performed perfectly. Now we set down, very simply, what is true, and afterwards we shall leave the house to Alder, who will put the furniture back, and the day may learn to be ordinary again." He touched the matchbook without taking it up. "Yesterday, at 3, Monsieur Lockwood lit a Turkish cigarette by the corridor mirror and admired himself under the first curl of smoke. He carried the case that shows 2 sorts, darker, lighter, theatrical, and domestic. One of these cigarettes had been handled at the mouth by a hand that paints tidily and dries what it paints with impatience. The varnish traces remain. When flame meets certain salts, she is an excellent courier. Our victim drew once, and the bitterness, he thought it his own cleverness rewarded by novelty. How charming, came with the first heat. He smiled, Mademoiselle tells us, and he died. Lady Constance's breath came out like silk pulled from a drawer too fast. Grant's hand did an irritated motion and subsided. Afterwards, Poirot went on, someone who loves order more than safety wished to move the hour. He lowered the awning half. He did not finish the gesture, because it was not the gesture that mattered. It was the effect. A half mind makes a half shade. Pritchard, who knows an honest shadow, has told us. Later, Monsieur Grant, whose god is the telephone, raised it again, for his own comfort. The murderer, seeing that I had noticed the geometry of the rug, corrected another small thing he could bear no longer. The proud cigarette in the case was set even. You observe the pattern. A person who cannot endure an untidy line. His eyes rested, for the length of a metronome's tick, on Moreau's hands, square, clean, Still. "The bottle in the bin, PF," he said lightly, and Lady Constance's mouth twitched in relief at the sound. "Mrs. Hargreaves's honour stands on both feet this morning. The orchard will be ferocious to wasps, but the bottle, empty, anonymous, was an actor's prop waiting in the wings. Someone wished the inspector to have an object, because objects comfort men who fear thinking. I fear thinking less than I fear props." Grant's laugh showed his teeth and nothing else. "You will forgive the city for our habits. We require figures. You shall have them." Poirot returned so pleasantly that Grant paused. At 4:20, the sun wrote a bar across the carpet that the leg of the chair should have intersected. It did not. At 5:30, it should have written a longer bar. It had been forced to write a shorter one. I will not weary you with the inches. Pritchard keeps them in his head. It is enough to say the hour of death, which for our murderer was 20 past, was made to appear nearer to 5:30, when Monsieur Grant, alarmed, discovered what he discovered. The sunlight, like a witness who stammers when bullied, appeared to contradict itself. It did not. It complained. It is very moral, the sun. He lifted the blue paper. Before he died, Monsieur Lockwood sent a request to Marseille. Marseille has replied, and London has forwarded the courtesy by the first post. Félix Morand struck off in 1921 for cause. He practiced thereafter as another man. He has practiced in England as Félix Moreau. This is not scandal. It is a biography that refused to stay quiet. Monsieur Lockwood, who loved to underline his own epigrams, would have printed this without the footnotes, and then eaten the attention with both hands. Our murderer could not permit this meal. Every face altered very slightly. Shadows where there had been none, an extra light in the cornea, a breath that tried to make itself square with its neighbour. Only Moreau's face did not move. It opened, if anything, by a degree, like a window unlatched, to politely admit weather that will come in any case. "I will not make a theatre of motive," Poirot said more gently. "It is not my art to preach. There is, however, this. Men who live tidily with their pasts will do a very ugly thing to prevent another from putting that past in the street. Monsieur le Docteur tells us this with his hands, when he aligns his knife, with his feet, when he evades a shadow on the glass, with his breath, when he declines sugar, because sweetness is not precise. He tells us again," Poirot's finger indicated the little black cap, "when he steals a lighter and burns not only metal, but the wick that has learned what it was made to touch. Ether leaves the shire smell. Alder found it with me last night in Sir Alister's writing closet, where a corner of a letter died clumsily and left a French stamp behind for consolation. The casement was opened by a finger. One should not make windows accomplices. They talk." The inspector cleared his throat. "We shall," he began, and stopped, because Poirot lifted a hand, as a conductor lifts a palm for silence before the last bar. "There is one more small truth, and then, Inspector, the business becomes yours. Yesterday, everyone believed they were at tea when Monsieur Grant found the body. But Rose, who has the merit of telling the truth when she is frightened, passed the library at 5:45 and saw no one. The marzipan breath that Pritchard smelled was between the quarters. Monsieur Moreau tells us, because he cannot refrain from exactness, that he prepared his mischief in the corridor. At 20 past, Jasper Lockwood sat in the square, smiled at his own line, and died. There was time enough for a neat man to lower an awning, to close a book upon a lap with the care one gives to a child's lids, to put a case back in a pocket, to let a chair remain where its leg would not betray the hour, because a half awning makes a half shadow. There was time enough to step into the morning room, rinse the fingers with a glass of water that will later allow one to be in the pantry without being in need of it, and to be present at tea, as if tea were all one's heart desired. There was also time later to discover, like a surgeon who cannot leave a bandage crooked, that a cigarette in a row did not sit as it should, and to correct it. This last hand, mes amis, is the hand I waited for. It is a hand that cannot not correct. The room, which had been breathing in Poirot's cadence, held itself still. The sunlight from the open doors came in without asking, and laid itself along the carpet, as if the house had been built for it to lie there. A bee blundered and reconsidered. Iris made a very small sound in her throat. It was not distress. It was something nearer to pity. "There remains," Poirot said in the tone men use when they say the last sentence in a letter to someone they will not see again, "a kindness. Dr. Moreau, you will tell us whether there is any patient of yours, any person, that depends upon you now in such a way that the inspector may arrange a substitution. It is better that I ask, because I will ask with respect." The doctor's face altered at last, and not in the way men expect. It softened into humanity, the very thing his tidiness had kept at bay. "There is an R period," he said, and looked, of all places, at Iris. "A woman with a name that does not wish to be spoken until it can be spoken safely. She is not ill, she is merely caught. I had thought that if my past were shouted, her present would be used as a stick. I do not apologize for wishing to keep sticks out of other people's hands. I apologize for choosing, in order to achieve it, a thing that is beneath the dignity of a man." Poirot inclined his head. "You have told a truth with a cost to yourself. It comes late, but it arrives." Grant made an impatient sound, as if the conversation had taken a turn unprofitable to him. "Very pretty," he said. "Meanwhile a man is dead because he made noise for a living. Inspector, the law, the inspector said, surprising everyone, including himself, will arrive at the door as it ought. Mr. Poirot, if you have finished—" "Almost." Poirot rose. He took up the matchbook and struck one, then another. He held the third high, so that its small flame could not trouble the carpet, and so that the air's behavior could be seen by any who cared for such details. The flame stood up, straight. It neither guttered nor reached. "You see? No draught. We have closed the window." He blew it out and set the blackened stick beside the lighter's little ruin. "When I came to this house, a man had died as if asleep in a chair. There was no struggle, no mark, no obvious scent, only an absence, a shadow that did not fall when it should. In the end, the absence was the whole of it. We closed the window, and the absence admits what it was hiding." He turned to Alder. "My friend," he said with a warmth he kept for those whose art is service, "you will do me a kindness. Bring to the library 5 chairs. We will sit as friends who have disagreed. I will say, from the beginning, how the thing was done, for the sake of the house, and of the clock, and of the sun. It is better that the truth be put in order before the newspapers turn it into furniture." Alder bowed as if requested to lay out the family silver. The inspector stepped aside to let Duty enter the room before him, and found that Duty had a steadier tread than it had the night before. Sir Alister drew a long breath and let it go without bothering to make it optimistic. Lady Constance pressed her lace to both eyes at once, in case one was late to the fashion, and then lowered it clean. Iris stood without rising, and then did rise because it seemed to her, obscurely, that respect was being paid to something, and she must not be short of it. Poirot, moving last, paused again at the little sash, and touched it, as one touches a creature that has behaved. "Voilà," he said softly, to the wood and the glass and the patient mourning. "We are done with the draught. In one more telling, we will be done with the shadow." They took their places in the library, as one takes one's marks upon a stage already lit. Alder brought the 5 chairs and arranged them in a slight crescent, so that no one could pretend to be peripheral. The French doors were open to the bright lawn. The awning was furled. The square of sunlight lay upon the carpet like a clean page. The inspector stood to one side, because justice, when it behaves, does not sit. Sir Alister, with a face that had given up its quarrel with dignity, sat at the left. Lady Constance managed to sit and be looked at. Lionel Grant angled himself toward the hall, as men angle toward exits in case of fire. Iris folded herself into the chair nearest the piano. Dr. Moreau took the remaining seat with the carefulness of a man who will not let furniture make a liar of him. Poirot remained standing for a moment longer, his hands together as if he were about to give grace. "We will begin," he said, "not with murder, but with vanity." Jasper Lockwood adored his reflection, on glass, on paper, in the faces of others. Yesterday after luncheon, he took a cigarette at the corridor mirror and made of the first exhalation a picture. At some earlier moment, a hand had prepared a little theatre at the mouth of one cigarette, a trace of solution, where a man puts his lips, dried as neatly as varnish on a violin. The salt was no improvisation. It wanted a tidy mind and a steady wrist and the habit of small doses that are never guessed at until they have spoken. He opened the silver case on the low table and let them see the obedient Rao. He selected from this bed of mixed pleasures a Turkish, darker paper, heavier scent. He lit it with his own lighter. The flame charred the poison enough to carry its malice where he would not taste it at once. He thought the bitterness belonged to the cigarette's character and approved himself for noticing. He went into the library with his book and his admiration. He sat in the armchair, there, and after one draw, the machine of the body listened to the wrong instruction. He let the sentence rest in the air until the ticking of the hall clock distinguished itself again from the silence it had been hiding in. At 20 minutes past 4, he died. Not with a show, no clutching, no struggle to flatter his audience. The head tipped, the book sat on the lap, as a child sits on a lap when the parent sleeps. The room suggested a doze, because the murderer preferred suggestion to spectacle. He is a doctor, of that I am now content, and doctors do not love melodrama when they can have order. Grant's mouth clicked. Lady Constance breathed more slowly. Iris's hands were very still upon her skirt. "Now," Poirot continued, "you will say, how do we know the hour? We do not use the constable's clock or the inspector's. We ask the sun, which does not lie. At 20 past, with the doors open and the awning up, the square on the rug is exact. The chair leg, if it stands within it, writes a bar of shade across the light, like the downstroke of a letter. Yesterday when I arrived, the square was present, and the imprint of the leg upon the nap of the carpet lay there, but the bar of shadow did not accompany it. Someone had tampered with the witness. The awning had been lowered halfway, a lazy deceit, but sufficient to blur the edges so that the square became a softened rectangle, and the eye could be persuaded that the time was later when Mr. Grant, who has a love affair with telephones, stumbled upon the scene. Grant gave a short laugh that tried for derision and achieved only fatigue. I raised the awning because the sun was in my eyes. Just so, said Poirot with courtesy. You undid without knowing it a little lie that was not yours. Pritchard, who watches roses and therefore sees shadows, observed both the first halfway descent, done quickly by a light step, and later your impatient correction, with chalk upon your finger to prove your annoyance. Meanwhile our murderer, who cannot endure crookedness, corrected a second thing, the proud cigarette in the case which had betrayed his first tampering. He made the row even. There is a logic to his vice. He cannot leave alone the imperfection, even when the imperfection would have been his alibi. Moreau said nothing. He sat with his hands placed square upon his knees, as if awaiting the moment when they would be asked to carry a weight. The room itself spoke of cleanliness, Poirot went on more softly. And yet there were these little betrayals, a faint bitter almond ghost that Pritchard smelled between the quarters, a whisper of ether in Sir Alister's writing closet late last night, where paper had been encouraged to forget itself. The casement lifted no more than a finger's breadth to lend flame ambition. the stamp left behind on a grate like a farewell a clerk would recognize. The lighter, poor little accomplice, stolen from Alder's safe during a moment of careless key, burned to ruin in the garden incinerator, as if metal could be taught to forget the task it had been made to do. All these tidyings tell one story: a mind that cannot bear residue, that fears scent because scent is untidy and lingers, that trusts fire the way some men trust water. It is the mind of a surgeon as he wishes to be. It is also the mind of a man who has learned to live beside a past that must be kept flat. He lifted the thin blue slip from Marseille and held it without triumph. Jasper Lockwood, who loved to underline his own epigrams, wrote for Proof about Félix Morin. Struck off in 1921. Proof has replied, "Dr. Félix Moreau is the name that replaced the other. I will not speculate whether the striking off was justice or politics. I have seen both wearing the same hat. I will say only that Mr. Lockwood would have printed the hat and asked the reader to admire it. Our murderer did not intend to be a column." There was a slight movement. Lady Constance's hand toward her pearls, Grant's glance toward the door, Sir Alister's eyes shutting once like a man who has looked too long at a bright thing. Iris looked not at Moreau, but at the square of light, as if it were a line of music she could keep true by listening. Poirot set the paper down and addressed the doctor with that grave civility he keeps for the moment when a man's privacy becomes a public matter. "Monsieur, when I asked you whether the marzipan breath came from the room or the corridor, you answered precisely. You could not help it. Precision is your gospel. It is also your confession. You prepared the cigarette out of the room, so the roses would be made the convenient culprit if any scent lingered. You returned the case to Mr. Lockwood's pocket or to the table. Alder thinks the pocket. I think you are too neat to leave silver where it does not belong. And you stood near enough to watch him make the first draw, not because you love the theatre, but because you cannot bear an uncontrolled variable. You looked again after the first tranquillity, and saw the square of light would write the hour. You adjusted the awning. It took 10 seconds, perhaps 12. Then the telephone summoned Monsieur Grant's impatience, and your edit of time was not so neat as you would have liked. You returned later to amend a cigarette and to burn a memory. Moreau's voice, when it came, had in it the fatigue of a man who has finished something rather than begun it. If I say the strike from the rolls was a name for a quarrel between men who had never seen a ward, you will answer that I should have fought with paper, not with chemistry. I will answer, Poirot said, that you chose a murder which looked like sleep, and sleep is what the guilty tell themselves when they prefer not to call a thing by its name. You are not a butcher. I have met those. But you are a man who could not endure disorder, and so created the worst kind, hoping to polish it away. There is also this. You left no shadow when you could help it. Last night at the glass, you took the place where the candle would not put your outline upon the pane. You moved your foot, rather than endure the bar written by the chair. These are small things, but murder is made of small things. The inspector stirred, then checked himself, as if he were a footman in a better house than his own. "Dr. Moreau," he said awkwardly, "you'll come with me." Moreau stood. For the first time his hands looked uncertain, not because they shook, but because they had nothing immediately useful to do. He placed them together. "I will write 2 notes," he said, looking past the inspector to Sir Alister, as a man obtains permission from the house. "One to R, so that no one else will write to her with the wrong kind of interest, and one to the hospital about a dressing at 5. They will send another pair of hands. Hands are common. The rest—" He allowed himself a small, rueful breath. "The rest is my own to carry." "Vous êtes gentil," Poirot said, and there was no irony in it. "Alder will provide paper. Inspector, you will indulge 5 minutes for 2 envelopes. It will save you 3 days of tidying what does not belong to you." The arrangement was made with the brisk grace English houses assume when it is necessary to do something undignified in a dignified way. While Moreau wrote, Lady Constance sat very straight and did not cry. She pinched colour into her mouth and kept it there. Grant muttered something about the city punishing fuss, and then, discovering he could not make a moral from a market, fell quiet. Sir Alister stared at the carpet where the square was sliding, and said at last, to no one, and to the house, I shall replace the awning, and only afterwards seemed to understand what he had confessed to loving about that idea, the power to let the light in without resort to half measures. Iris rose and, moved by a courtesy that was not show, placed the metronome upon the piano and stopped its pendulum with a touch. The ticking in the hall could resume its proper dominion. Moreau sealed the notes and gave them to Alder, who received them as if they were sacrament, and then, with an unobtrusive efficiency that would have made a cathedral proud, ensured their dispatch. The inspector, whose sense of ceremony had grown by acquaintance with Alder, stood not beside Moreau, but a pace behind, as if escorting rather than apprehending. At the door, the doctor paused. He did not look at Poirot, who had made of him a figure. He looked at Iris. You play Bach as if you owe him the truth, he said. Do not stop because of me. I will not stop, she said, and it was not kindness. It was a promise to herself. They went. The sound that followed them down the corridor was not the sound of irons. It was the decorous judgment of shoes on polished wood. The house, which had had its heart held too long, exhaled. Not relief, not exactly. The primitive thing that follows a sudden stilling of noise. Sir Alister rose and offered his hand to Poirot, with a gratitude that could not quite forgive the necessity for gratitude. You have done your work, he said. We are obliged. I shall be... He searched for the word, and because he was honest enough to refuse the easy ones, said simply, tidying. Ah, Poirot said, smiling with an old man's tenderness at a man who thinks the world can be made square by will. Then we are brothers for a day. Lady Constance, who had watched this with the expression of a woman who has escaped a scandal by a width invisible to the naked eye, leaned nearer. Tell me only, she said softly, if I can pretend, if one can pretend, to have been brave. One can always pretend, Poirot said. Sometimes the pretense is rehearsal for the truth. Be brave when no one is looking. It leaves fewer smudges. Grant made a dismissive sound and went in search of the telephone, because appetite, unlike morals, does not lose its timetable. Iris remained, standing where the square of light had thinned to a pale oblong. She looked at Poirot with the relief of someone allowed at last to be tired. Will they say the title? She asked unexpectedly, and then coloured at her own question. In the papers. The murderer who left no shadow. Will they say it because it is pretty? They will, Poirot said, and his moustaches sighed. Because prettiness is easier than accuracy. But you and I, we will remember that the shadow was there to be cast and was avoided, and that the draught was the truth of it. That is less pretty and more exact. Alder, who had been present without intruding in the way of angels and butlers, moved the chairs back an inch to where the carpet remembered they had been happy. He looked to Poirot. Shall I close the doors, sir? Not yet, Poirot said, and stepped onto the terrace where the roses lay without philosophy in their beds. He looked back through the glass at the armchair, at the table with its prim case, at the ashtray that would presently be emptied, at the matchbook that had made its small boast and would return to anonymity. The square on the rug slipped away without sentiment. Let the sun finish his sentence, he said. Then we will let Alder make the full stop. He stood there until the last edge of the bright square withdrew, tidy as a card slid back into its deck. Only then did he turn into the room and close the French doors with a careful hand, the catch answering him with that modest, satisfying click he loves. Voilà, he murmured. We have put the chairs straight. We have shut the window. And the son, who is the most exact of witnesses, has gone about his other business. It was not yet noon, and already the day had the feel of something completed. The inspector's motor would crush the gravel and carry its proper burden. Sir Alister would attend to letters, and then perhaps the orchard. Lady Constance would telephone her solicitor with details artfully imprecise. Lionel Grant would eat the markets. Iris would play a prelude without making it consolation. Poirot looked once more at the room, that obedient theatre where men had tried to edit light, and then reached for his hat. "There is a train at 2, he told Alder, who already knew. "And coffee at 1, if you will spoil me." "With pleasure, sir," Alder said, and the words were not a politeness, but a restoration. Poirot paused at the threshold, and because he is himself, he bent to align a book with its neighbour on the lower shelf, where no one would have noticed if it leaned. "It is a small thing," he said to the book, to the shelf, to the house. "But small things, they are the whole of it." He straightened and went toward the hall, where the clock, decent and implacable, put down the quarter with a sound like a promise kept. The inspector's motor did precisely as expected. It crushed the gravel and shrank along the drive, carrying away a man who had chosen order over mercy and discovered, too late, what kind of disorder that makes. The house accepted the subtraction with grace. The bees resumed their arithmetic, the roses withheld opinion, and Alder, with a discretion that was practically devotional, restored the drawing-room to its prelapsarian geometry. In the library, the ashtray was emptied, the cheap matchbook demoted from exhibit to nuisance, and the silver cigarette case, having performed its career, was wrapped in tissue and placed in a drawer until the coroner should ask for a bow upon the parcel of truth. Poirot took his coffee at 1 and permitted himself the quiet pleasure of a perfectly cut sandwich. Sir Alister joined him with the expression of a man who has been reprimanded by fate and is noble enough to accept it without making requisitions upon innocence. He wanted to speak of reputation, of the papers, of how one restores a house's name, which had not, after all, sinned. Poirot listened with that softness which is kindness for men who wish the world to be as obedient as furniture. He answered at last that nothing on earth behaves better under a cloth than scandal. Cover it wholly, and the shape shows more plainly. Let it breathe, and it collapses like a cake that has been opened too soon. "You will give your staff a holiday, perhaps," he said, "and your inspector a statement that is exact and without embroidery. You will not, if you love your house, rearrange the library for a month. The room must forget the theatre we required of it." Sir Alister almost smiled. "You think of rooms as persons." "I think of persons as rooms," Poirot corrected gently. "They prefer a little air, a small order, a door closed without anger. And you, monsieur, you will resist the temptation to replace your awning tomorrow. It will feel to you like tidiness. In truth, it will be impatience. Wait a week. The sun does not keep grudges." After coffee, he walked the terrace. Pritchard, who had achieved the stillness of a sundial without being made of stone, touched his cap with the dignity of a man who had smelt a ghost and been believed. "They've brought back Mrs. Hargreaves," he said in his plain way. "Came up the lane like she were returning the keys of the parish." "Bon," Poirot said. "A house breathes better when its memory comes home." She came at once to the library, of course. Alder was there, and the two stood for a moment with that mutual regard true generals have when the battle ends and no one is counting ribbon. She thanked Poirot by not wasting his time. "I've told the inspector that my bin is not a museum," she said. "I've told him that gardeners use nasty bottles for honest work. He understood me on the second attempt. I will have his boots wiped next time he enters, for example." Poirot bowed as one accepts a promotion. "Madame, you have been inconvenient to injustice. It makes life better for the rest of us." Lionel Grant passed through the hall like a man whose reflection has followed him too closely. He paused just long enough to say, too heartily, that markets hate death because it confuses appetite. Poirot permitted himself the smallest shrug. Markets, he said, prefer certainty to virtue. They do not mind which. Lady Constance telephoned, and was overheard by the house to tell her solicitor that she had endured a ghastly little opera, but had preserved her composure and would not be answering questions from anyone whose hat brim was not sufficiently curved. She came to thank Poirot, and did so as if returning a borrowed book. He advised her, mildly, to dismiss her maid's pernicious vinaigrette, and to consider almonds a private affair hereafter. Perfume, he said with the ghost of a smile, is for declaring affection, not innocence. He found Iris last, where he expected to find her, seated at the piano, hands folded, not yet playing because one does not intrude music upon a house until the house is ready. She rose when he entered, and then did not go on rising into apology or explanation. "I am glad you asked for Bach," she said. "He made the air honest." "It is what we require," Poirot answered. "Honest air. Your observation, mademoiselle, the mirror, the metronome, the squares of light, was a great kindness to me. It is a rare thing, precision without malice." She coloured and looked down. "I only saw what you had put in order to be seen. It felt like dusting, not discovery." "Discovery," he said, "is the finest dusting. It leaves the form and removes the film." He hesitated, then added, because he is not cruel, "As for our comma, you need not be afraid. Men who speak her initial in the manner of a password will find they have arrived too late. The inspector will not be the messenger they imagine." She met his eyes with that brave, plain gaze of those who have been made invisible once and have found some profit in it. "He said I played as if I owed the truth to someone," she murmured. "It frightened me a little." "Keep the debt," Poirot advised. "Pay it to the music. Human beings demand interest. Music only asks for time." In the early afternoon, the village postman, inflated by the importance of correspondence bound for London, delivered the Marseille packet with its officious stamps and its weary confirmations. The inspector, who had learned by now the value of not trumpeting what time will shout for free, received it with composure, and telephoned the town for a quiet cell and a less quiet magistrate. He asked Poirot, almost humbly, whether he would care to draft a paragraph for his report. Poirot declined, and suggested instead a single sentence. "The hour of death is established by the sun. The rests of the case follow." The inspector wrote it down, discovered to his surprise that he was proud of it, and asked whether it were proper to keep a matchbook that had been of use. "It is proper," Poirot said gravely, "to throw it away and remember." There remained the matter of the lighter's ghost, the cigarette case, and the book Lockwood had been reading. Alder wrapped the lighter's ruin, and the case, and the underlined volume, and placed them in a box stout enough for the journey to the inquest. He left the box upon the hall table, precisely where the afternoon could not ignore it. Then, with the quiet relief of men who are allowed at last to be practical, he returned to the pantry and oversaw the polishing of the day's tarnish. The motor at 2 was punctual in the way trains are when one has calculated upon them. Poirot's valise, which never acquires dust, because dust does not dare, stood at attention. Sir Alister himself, having accepted that gratitude requires witnesses, came to the steps. Words were said that did not need to be remembered. Poirot shook his hand with the gentle pressure he affords the contrite, and then, because he could not help himself, he looked once more at the facade, the windows, the awning furled. He lifted his hand in a small salute to the library, which had behaved impeccably under examination. Alder appeared with a paper parcel that had the moral weight of a benediction. "From Mrs. Bridie, sir. Sandwiches for the journey. And from me," he added, "the assurance that the library will be put back not today, not tomorrow, but when it has forgiven us." "You are a philosopher, Alder," Poirot said, touched, and therefore a conservative. He had a corner alone in the carriage, and being a man who never wastes solitude, arranged his thoughts as he arranged his ties, one for duty, one for remembrance, one for that small human pity that makes justice something more than tidiness. He wrote a note to a friend in London who knows when to speak to editors and when to discourage them. He drafted a line to the Marseille clerk, thanking him for a promptness that had arrived a day too late for tragedy and exactly in time for truth. He reconsidered, with an indulgence bordering upon amusement, Lionel Grant's anger at sunlight and Lady Constance's loyalty to appearances, and then let them go, as one lets go smaller weights so that the mind is free to carry the essential. At a wayside stop, the inspector joined the carriage for 2 minutes of apology and instruction. He stood with his hat in his hands and made promises that were, for once, not political, but personal. Mrs. Hargreaves's dignity would be protected. Pritchard would not be questioned in any manner that suggested the roses had been at fault. Dr. Moreau would be allowed a coat and a book and a barber before he was displayed to anyone who pretended to be the public. Poirot, who dislikes cruelty disguised as interest, approved and said so. "You saw it early, sir," the man admitted, surprising himself by humility twice in one day. "The business of the shadow." "It was not a shadow," Poirot corrected gently. "It was its absence, a thing that should have been there and was not. Murder often is only that, the missing stitch. You mend from the gap." He watched the hedges go by, bright and indifferent. He thought of Jasper Lockwood, whose last approval had been for his own line, of Moreau, who had evaded a shadow until the sun, patient and incorruptible, wrote one for him he could not correct, of Iris, who would play a sarabande this evening, not for consolation, but to keep the day in tune. In another life, perhaps, the doctor might have caged his fastidiousness in a ward and saved 100 children from the small slovenlinesses that kill. In this life, he had tried to tidy time, and had discovered that time dislikes being dusted. The law would say the rest. Poirot had said all he could say, and a little more than he liked. At Paddington, there was the bustle that forgives all provincial dramas by absorbing them. The porter's whistle had the sound of something brisk and merciful. Poirot, whose moustaches were unruffled by rail, stepped down and felt the city take him back as a thing that had wandered briefly into allegory and was pleased to be once more among pavements. A boy with evening papers was already rehearsing variations on the truth. He called "Murder in a Library," famous detective present, with the improvised grace that turns tragedy into currency. Poirot smiled and did not buy one. He preferred his facts unshouted. Before he hailed a cab, he glanced at the western sky, where the afternoon takes its time with London. A single long cloud lay like a grey awning drawn halfway across the blue. It reminded him of the striped canvas at Greyfriars and of the little deceit attempted against the sun. He raised his hat to the weather as to an old colleague. "One cannot persuade the light," he said aloud, "not to the crowd, but to himself, which is the only audience worth flattering. It will fall where it must. The cleverness is not to hide, but to stand correctly." He paused, considered, and let the phrase improve itself. "And if one cannot stand correctly, one must learn to confess." The cab pulled up. The driver asked, "Where to, sir?" with that cheerfulness London keeps for foreigners who behave. Poirot gave his address and settled back, the paper parcel on his knee, the small, exact smile of a man who has put a chair straight and can now permit himself an apple tart. At Greyfriars, the sun went on with its business. It laid the last of itself along the carpet, modest and final, and then withdrew without sentiment. Alder, keeping his promise to the room, drew the doors to with the soft click of approval. In the silence left behind, the house did what English houses do best when they have survived scandal. It began quietly to forget and to remember only what had been put in order.